3 seconds before the explosion, the boy dropped the bucket. The sound of it striking the stone floor was small, almost ridiculous against the layered noise of the practice hall. The scrape of boots, the rustle of robes, the low murmur of students trying not to look nervous in front of one another, and above all the steady, assured voice of Magister Han Sung-joon as he guided the fourth formation through a standard synchronization exercise. It was supposed to be one of the safest drills in the lower academy. That was what made the laughter come so quickly when the bucket slipped from the hands of a 10-year-old cleaning boy and rolled in a wobbling circle across the wet floor. Kim Min-joon did not even look at it. He was staring at the formation circle. Not at the glowing chalk lines, not at the crystal anchor mounted on the brass stand in the center, not even at Magister Han. He was staring at the third student from the left, the tall boy with the sharp jaw and the expensive gloves, because the boy's right shoulder had risen half an inch too high on the last intake of breath. Min-joon saw the tiny tremor in the fingers before the release point. He saw the assistant on the outer ring shift the stabilizing rod just a little too close to the anchor basin. He saw the hesitation in the second beat of the cadence, so slight that no one listening for power would notice it. But Min-joon had never had mana to listen to. He listened to everything else. "Stop," he shouted. His voice cracked with the force of it, too young, too thin, too easy to ignore. Several students looked back at him with open irritation. One of the assistants cursed and strode toward him. Magister Han did not even turn fully around, he only frowned in the offended way of a man interrupted during a lesson by someone beneath his notice. "Get him out," he said. "Now." Min-joon took a step forward instead of back. "Stop the circle," he shouted again, louder this time, and then, because panic sharpened him to cruelty, he pointed toward the left side of the room and yelled, "The blast is going to break left." That was the moment the hall changed. Not because anyone believed him. Because the wealthy boy in the circle finally realized something was wrong and instinctively tried to force the technique forward instead of letting it collapse. The crystal anchor in the center gave a high, shrill whine. A white fracture flashed through the air above the formation lines like a crack moving across frozen water. Magister Han snapped his head around at last. One assistant lunged toward the anchor basin. Another shouted for the students to hold steady. Someone screamed. Then the entire left side of the practice circle exploded. Stone shattered outward in a wave of heat and splinters. The window lattice burst inward like brittle bones. Two students nearest the left arc were thrown sideways hard enough to flip over the benches behind them. A panel of carved wood struck the wall and snapped in half. Min-joon hit the ground before the blast wave reached him, more from old habit than courage, arms over his head, face pressed to the wet stone that still smelled faintly of soap and dust. Something heavy crashed where he had been standing a moment earlier. The hall filled with heat, smoke, chalk powder, and the terrible human sounds that always came after magic failed, confused shouting, the wet choke of someone trying to breathe through burned lungs, the thin animal crying of children too shocked to understand they were hurt. For one long second nobody moved with purpose. Authority had been blown apart along with the circle. Then the assistants began shouting all at once. "Seal the room! Get the healer! Don't touch the anchor! Count the students!" Magister Han staggered back from the shattered center, one sleeve burning at the cuff, his expression not proud or angry now but blank with disbelief. He looked like a man seeing his own reflection behave differently than expected. Min-joon pushed himself up to one knee and immediately someone seized him by the collar from behind. It was one of the older assistants, Park Do-yoon, a broad-shouldered graduate aide with burned scars across his jaw and the permanent resentment of a man only a few humiliations away from realizing he would never become important. He slammed Min-joon back to the floor and pinned him there with a forearm across the neck. "What did you do?" he barked. Min-joon could barely breathe. "Nothing. You were shouting before the break. Because it was going to break. You touched the ring?" No. Park twisted his arm higher until pain flashed white behind Min-joon's eyes. "You filthy little rat, if you tampered with a lesson, enough." But command cut through the room without needing volume. Park froze. Min-joon turned his head as much as the pressure on his neck allowed and saw instructor Eugene Tae striding through the drifting smoke from the side corridor, coat unfastened, dark hair disordered, one hand already marked with fresh ash where he had shoved aside hot debris to get in. Eugene Tay did not belong to the polished center of the academy. Everybody knew that. He taught applied field discipline to older practical cohorts, the kind of classes noble families considered useful only when things had already gone wrong. He had the hard face of a man who had seen too many things fail in places where failure killed people outright instead of merely embarrassing them in front of witnesses. He did not look at Minjun first. He looked at the room. At the brake line. At the shattered left arc. At the student with the expensive gloves lying pale and stunned near the wall. At the crystal anchor still whining with unstable residue. Only then did his eyes settle on the boy pinned to the floor. "Let him up," you said. Park hesitated. "Sir," he disrupted I said let him up." Park removed his arm at once, but not gently. Minjun coughed, rolled to his side, and pushed himself upright. His knees hurt. His palms were full of grit. He could smell blood in burned cloth and hot brass. Around him, the hall was becoming orderly in the ugliest way possible. The badly injured had been separated from the stunned. One girl was sobbing over her blistered hands. Another boy stared dumbly at a shard of stone lodged in the bench inches from where his face had been a moment before. Healers in dark green coats began pouring into the room with cases and stretchers. Magister Han stood rigid at the center of it all, answering questions too quickly, before anyone could ask the wrong ones. Eugene Tay walked straight to the fractured edge of the circle, crouched, and touched 2 fingers to a scorched groove in the stone. His eyes moved once toward the left wall where the blast had broken hardest. Then he looked back at Minjun. "You," he said. "Come here." Minjun did not move at first. Children with rank moved when teachers called. Cleaning boys got dragged. Yu's face hardened by a fraction. "Now." Minjun stepped over scattered chalk fragments and broken splinters and stopped a few feet from the damaged circle. Several people in the room noticed. That alone made his skin crawl. He was used to existing below attention. Yu pointed to the floor. Where was the failure going to break? Minjun swallowed. Left arc. Why? The room had grown quieter around them. Not silent. Never silent. But thinner, stretched. Minjun could feel Magister Han listening without turning his head. He wanted to say nothing. He wanted to go back to hauling water and scraping wax off the lower corridors and be invisible again. But one of the students on the floor gave a ragged cough, and that decided it. The lead student lost the 3rd hold, Minjun said. Not enough for most people to see. But his right shoulder came up. He was compensating. Then the cadence was late on the 2nd beat, and the outer stabilizer was too close to the anchor. He pointed, not daring to touch. There. Yu's eyes flicked to the assistant station. Park Duyun's face tightened. Minjun kept going because stopping would make it worse. When the lead tried to force the release, the pressure couldn't vent forward. It folded. Left side had the weakest tolerance because the anchor basin was already skewed that way. Once the 3rd hold slipped, the brake had to travel left. Nobody spoke for a moment. A healer carrying bandages paused in the doorway. Even Magister Han finally turned, slowly, with the expression of a man being insulted in a language he cannot pretend not to understand. That is absurd, Han said. His voice was steady again, but only just. A child repeating corridor rumors does not constitute analysis. You did not look at him. Did the stabilizer shift? Park answered too fast. Only within training margin. Did it shift? You repeated. Park's jaw flexed. A fraction. You nodded once, as if another small thing had slipped into place in his mind. Then he faced Minjun again. How many times have you seen this pattern? Minjun should have lied. Any ordinary child would have lied. Instead, he looked at the burned line in the floor and said, Enough. Han let out a short, incredulous breath. This is nonsense. The boy is a cleaner. He does not belong in this hall, and certainly not in a technical inquiry. He belongs wherever your injured students are being carried out, you said flatly. That appears to be where he learns the curriculum. Several assistants looked away. Han's face darkened. Instructor, you, mind yourself. I am. You straightened. Perhaps someone should have done so before you began a lower cohort synchronization with a drifting outer stabilizer. That landed harder than a shout. Han's humiliation sharpened the room. Rank reassembled itself immediately, and Minjun knew he was about to be crushed under it. Han took one measured step closer. This will be reviewed formally, he said. Until then, all unauthorized personnel are barred from lesson spaces. Especially this boy. Remove him. Park looked almost relieved to have an order again. He gripped Minjun's shoulder and shoved him toward the doors. This time you did not stop it. He had seen enough. That did not mean he was willing to shield a cleaning boy from the academy's need to bury disgrace quickly. Minjun stumbled into the corridor outside, where the air was colder and carried the sharp medicinal smell of opened healer kits. Students from other halls had already gathered at a distance, whispering. Some stared at him as if he had crawled out of the fire himself. One of the younger boys from the practice formation was being wheeled past on a stretcher, face gray beneath ash, lips moving soundlessly. Another clutched burned hands against his chest while a healer murmured to him. Minjun stood flat against the wall and let them pass. No one thanked him. No one asked how he knew. By evening, the story had already changed. In the kitchens they said the lesson had failed because one student lost his nerve. In the lower dormitory corridors they said a cleaning boy had started screaming in the middle of the exercise and broken everyone's concentration. In the laundry room they said one of the assistants would likely take the blame, unless the magister found a way to blame the maintenance staff. In the storage basement where Minjun slept behind stacked soap crates and broken lamp stands, no one said anything to him directly. They only left his supper late and smaller than usual. That was how punishment worked for people like him. Not formally. Quietly. The next morning his work assignment had changed. No more upper academic corridors. No more practice hall floors. He was moved to ash hauling, cellar drainage, and furnace scrape in the old service wing, the kind of labor that blackened the hands and bent the back and kept a boy far away from anything important. When he carried the new duty slate to the quartermaster's desk, the man did not look up from his ledger. Be grateful you still have a place, he muttered. A magister was nearly disgraced yesterday. Nearly. As if the students in the healer's ward were a footnote to the true danger. Minjun took the slate and left without answering. He had learned a long time ago that anger from the powerless was treated as proof that power had been right about them all along. By midday the name-calling started. Not from adults. Adults preferred omission. It was always children who found the cruelest precision. Corpse crow, one novice hissed as Minjun dragged a cart of coal through the side passage. He only shows up where people get hurt. Another called him hall rat. A third asked loudly whether the cleaner planned to scream in every class now that he had had a taste of attention. Minjun kept walking. He had spent too many years near real suffering to waste energy on the theatrical versions children rehearsed for one another. But the words still lodged. Not because they were clever. Because they worked. By the second day no one in the lower wings spoke of the injured students. They spoke of the disruption. The embarrassment. The stain on the academy's order. This was the rule beneath all the other rules. If something ugly happened often enough, the institution stopped fearing the ugliness and began fearing only whoever pointed at it. Minjun spent that afternoon knee-deep in gray furnace ash, scraping clinker from the brick mouth of a heat chamber with a bent iron tool while soot settled into his hair and collar. The work was hot, airless, and perfect for thought he did not want. He kept seeing the lead student's shoulder rise. Kept hearing his own voice crack as he shouted. Kept remembering the leftward break. Worst of all, he remembered the timing. He had shouted too late. Not late enough to save the hall from blame. Late enough to fail one of the children nearest the line. If he had screamed one beat earlier, or run forward and kicked the stabilizer stand, or thrown the bucket instead of dropping it, he stopped the thought there. That way led nowhere useful. He had lived too long among broken outcomes to worship impossible better versions of himself. A shadow fell across the furnace room entrance. Min-jun did not look up immediately. Service boys were called by whistles, kicks, or thrown objects, not patient silence. When he finally turned, Eugene Tae was standing in the doorway with one hand braced against the blackened stone, as if he had been there long enough to see the shape of the room before speaking. He had changed coats since the explosion. This one was plain dark wool, old at the seams, with no attempt at scholarly elegance. There was a fresh bandage wrapped once around his left wrist. "You're difficult to find when people are hiding you on purpose," you said. Min-jun set down the scraper. "I wasn't hiding." You glanced at the ash cart, the cracked shovel, the heat-scorched walls. "No. They were." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him against the corridor draft. The room shrank at once. Min-jun straightened automatically, unsure whether to bow or wait or apologize. You saved him the choice by speaking first. "The lead student lived," he said. "2 others will recover. One may lose fine control in his left hand." Min-jun stared at the floor. Recovery. That was how the academy would phrase it. Not who had screamed. Not who had been ignored. Recovery. You took another step forward. Yesterday, in the hall, you said the brake would go left before the anchor destabilized visibly. You were right. Min-jun said nothing. Today I reviewed 3 prior incident reports from lower synchronization classes. Yu's voice remained calm, but there was something under it now, a pressure of his own. 2 had similar injury patterns. 1 was filed as student frailty. 1 as an assistant's timing error. He watched Min-jun carefully. "So I'll ask you once. And I suggest you answer carefully." Min-jun lifted his head. Yu's eyes were not kind. That made them easier to trust. "How did you know?" For a moment Min-jun considered giving the safe answer. Luck. Guessing. Listening at doors. But he was 10 years old, exhausted, soot-blackened, hungry, and standing in a furnace room because he had tried to stop children from being burned alive. The safe answer felt obscene. "Because it always starts the same way," he said. "You did not move." "Always?" Min-jun's throat tightened. The words still came. The hall changes before the spell does. Someone is too tense or too proud or too tired. A hand shakes. A beat slips. An assistant pretends not to see something because stopping the lesson would be embarrassing. Then everyone keeps going because they all think a working spell is a correct spell. He could hear his own breathing now, too fast. And when it breaks, they call it bad luck. Or weakness. Or one student's fault. The ash in the room seemed suddenly too fine, too dry, as if one breath too hard might turn it into smoke again. Yu's face had gone very still. "You've seen this before," he said. It was not really a question. Min-jun looked past him to the furnace mouth, to the bed of dim coals pulsing red beneath white ash. Yes. How many times? Min-jun thought of the lurching stretchers in back corridors. Of old blood on mop water. Of the healer's wing at night. Of children who vanished from class rosters and were not spoken of again. He answered with the only truth that mattered. "Enough that I know when someone is going to die." You held his gaze for another second, then another. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" Min-jun gave a tiny, bitter laugh that did not sound like a child's laugh at all. "To who?" That landed between them and stayed there. You looked away first, but not in avoidance. In recognition. He had asked a question to which the academy itself was the answer. After a long pause he said, "Yesterday, when you shouted in the hall. Was that the first time you tried to stop it?" Minjun's hands curled black with soot at his sides. "No," he said. "It was the first time anyone heard me." You exhaled once through his nose. Not surprise. Not disbelief. Something heavier. Then he asked the question that changed the shape of the story without either of them yet knowing how much. "And the other times?" Minjun looked at him, looked at the bandaged wrist, the hard field teacher face, the man who was not safe but might at least be real. "The other times," he said quietly, "someone died. The academy moved quickly when it needed to protect its face." By the morning after the practice hall explosion, a formal inquiry document had been filed, reviewed, approved, and archived all in the same 24 hours, which was a speed the institution almost never achieved when students needed healers or instructors needed competence evaluations. The document's conclusion was brief and symmetrical. The incident had resulted from compounded individual errors during a standard lower cohort exercise, no systemic fault had been identified, remedial training would be assigned to the relevant assistant staff, and the matter was considered closed. Minjun read it by accident. He found the copy left on a bench in the secondary corridor by someone who had set it down to carry a crate and never come back for it. He read it twice. Then he folded it with the careful, emotionless precision of someone who had long since run out of surprise and tucked it under his shirt, because there was nowhere else to put things he was not supposed to have. That morning Eugene Tay found him outside the old equipment storeroom, rearranging broken lamp casings into the ash cart. You stopped a few feet away and watched him work without greeting him, which Minjun had already learned was the man's version of patience. Other teachers announced their presence to reassert authority. Eugene Tay arrived and waited, which was a different kind of authority altogether, and worse in some ways, because it was harder to pretend you hadn't noticed. "I have a question," you said. Minjun did not stop moving lamp casings. "Yes. 2 days ago in the hall, you identified a shoulder deviation and a cadence drift before the anchor destabilized. You described both of them in under 20 seconds. He paused. "How long have you been watching practice sessions?" Minjun thought about lying, not out of fear but out of habit. Instead he said, "Since I was 7. You let that sit. 3 years. 3 years of watching from corridors, cleaning around active formations, mopping floors after drills. Sometimes waiting outside the healer's wing for someone to need something carried." He set down a lamp casing. "You see a lot from service corridors." "I imagine you do," you said. "Do you understand what you were watching?" "No," Minjun said, and then, more honestly, not at first. But patterns don't need explaining. They just need enough repetitions. That was the first real moment Eugene Tay looked at him as something other than an incident. Not warmly. Not with sentiment. But with the particular sharpening of attention that a precise person gives to a variable that refuses to fit a comfortable explanation. Over the following 4 days, you tested him. Not formally, not with the kind of structured examination the academy ran on students of rank, but with the careful, probe-and-measure method of a man who distrusted first impressions in both directions. He would appear without warning in whatever service area Minjun had been assigned to and ask a question as if it had only just occurred to him. He asked why a student who had collapsed in the third practical wing 3 weeks ago had done so 20 minutes into the drill rather than at the high load point everyone expected. He asked what Minjun had noticed about the assistant who had been quietly transferred out of the lower formation division after only 6 months. He asked, on the 4th day, which of the 2 instructors demonstrating a joint release exercise in the eastern courtyard would make an error first, and when. Minjun watched through the narrow gap in the shuttered service window for approximately 4 minutes and then said, "The one on the left. He favors the dominant release and doesn't compensate when the partner's timing is slightly ahead of his own. It'll happen at the 3rd exchange, when he tries to push the pace." You watched him say this. Then he turned and observed the demonstration. The error happened at the 3rd exchange, exactly as described, a half-second loss of synchronization that the instructor covered with a forward lean that looked deliberate to anyone not watching the wrists. You turned back to Minjun. His expression was not impressed in the way of easy praise. It was the grim, flattened look of a man confirming something he had hoped might be coincidence. "Come with me," he said. The space you took him to was not an office. It was a records annex used for storing old correspondence and supply manifests, dusty and narrow, lit by 2 wall lanterns with greasy glass. It smelled of cold paper and old brass. You produced a wooden case from a shelf and set it on the reading table without ceremony. Inside were stacked folders of what looked, to Minjun, like accident logs. Not the polished inquiry summaries filed upstairs. These were raw work documents. The handwriting was uneven, the ink cheap, the margins full of cramped corrections. Injury reports from the lower practice wings going back 8 years. You sat across the table and said nothing. He simply waited. Minjun began to read. He read for a long time in the way he had taught himself to read during years of brief, interrupted moments, quickly, retaining without noise, making no marks on the paper. You watched him and occasionally made notes of his own, which Minjun chose to ignore because acknowledging them would make him self-conscious and self-consciousness made him less accurate. What the documents contained individually was unremarkable. Isolated. Each report had the same formal grammar of misfortune. A student had suffered a disruption of internal flow regulation, a student had experienced an adverse response to upper load channeling, a student had been transferred to the residential healer unit following complications during standard formation practice. The words were smooth, deliberate, efficient at communicating nothing. But when Minjun read them in sequence, in volume, not as isolated events but as a series, something entirely different emerged from the pattern. The injuries were not random. The variance was not distributed evenly across exercise types, cohort levels, or instructors. It gathered. It concentrated. It appeared in a particular shape around a particular kind of exercise, always within a specific window of the curriculum, always at a stage when students had just been introduced to a specific load-bearing technique that was considered foundational to intermediate formation work. A technique every student passed through. A technique that was mandatory. The word mandatory sat in Minjun's mind like a stone thrown into shallow water. The ripples changed the shape of everything around it. He set down the third folder and said, "It's the third stage synchronization technique. The one called primary flow consolidation." Yu's pen stopped moving. "Why that one?" "Because every case where the injury pattern repeats is within 2 weeks of when that technique is introduced in the curriculum. Before and after that window, the injury distribution changes completely. The only consistent variable is that technique and the specific stage of pressure it generates at full extension." He touched the edge of the folder without opening it. "It doesn't hurt everyone. Only the ones who are doing it correctly." You looked up from his notes. "Explain." "If you do it wrong, the load redistributes early and you get minor symptoms. The system kind of fails safely. But if you're talented enough to hold the full form properly, you reach the extension point that the technique was designed around, and something in that point is wrong. Not wrong for a weak channeler. Wrong specifically for a strong one. The better the student, the more precisely they hit the flaw." He watched Yu's face as he said it, waiting for dismissal or ridicule or the polite blankness that adults used to end conversations that made them uncomfortable. What he saw instead was the look of a man reconstructing a building in his mind and finding a load-bearing wall missing. "Say that again," Yu said quietly. "The better the student, the more precisely they hit the flaw." The room was very still. Through the narrow window of the annex, Minjun could hear the sound of a lower courtyard exercise session, the rhythmic call and response of a drill instructor counting beats. Ordinary academy sound. The same sound that had been playing in the background of 8 years of injury reports. Yu set down his pen. He did not fold his hands or lean back or perform any of the gestures that adults used to suggest they were considering something calmly. He stared at the table surface between them and said nothing for long enough that Minjun began to count the water stains on the nearest folder. "The technique in question," Yu said at last, "has been part of the core formation curriculum for over 20 years. Every cohort passes it. Every instructor teaches it as foundational. It has been evaluated and approved through 3 separate syllabus revisions. Yes, Min-jun said. How does that change the pattern? Another silence. This one had a different quality. Not the silence of disbelief. The silence of a man checking his own architecture for flaws and not liking what the inspection returned. The Academy's syllabus committee reviewed consolidation technique documentation 12 years ago, you said. His voice had shifted to something flatter, more precise. I was not on that committee. But I was present for the outcome briefing. The technique was marked stable. No systematic injury flag. Min-jun said nothing. Sometimes saying nothing was the clearest statement available. You stood and moved to the window. He looked out at the courtyard below, at the instructor calling beats, at the students moving in careful synchronized rows, at the ordinary machinery of an institution that had been running for a very long time without stopping to count what it left behind. If you are correct, he said, without turning, then what we are describing is not a series of unfortunate incidents. No, Min-jun said. It isn't. We are describing a curriculum that has been reliably injuring its best students for 2 decades and classifying each injury as an individual failure. Min-jun looked at the stacked folders. 8 years. These were only the ones in this room. Yes, he said. You turned away from the window. His face held the particular expression Min-jun had seen a few times in his life on adults who had just discovered that something they had trusted was built wrong. Not anger. Not shock. The specific exhausted resolution of a person who realizes they are not going to be able to unknow what they have just understood. How long have you suspected this? He asked. Min-jun thought about the first time he had noticed the pattern. He had been 8 years old, mopping the healer wing corridor after a practice session, watching a gifted student from the elite formation class be carried out on a board for the second time in 2 months, and thinking that there was something strange about how only the best ones seemed to need carrying. 2 years, he said. Approximately. You exhaled through his nose, a single controlled breath. And you said nothing. I said what I was. I was a cleaning boy. No mana. No family name. No academic standing. If I had gone to any instructor with a folder of injury reports and said the core curriculum is injuring students, what would have happened? You did not answer. The answer was obvious to both of them. So I watched, Min-jun said. And I counted. He looked at the folders, at the years stacked inside them, at the careful formal language covering 20 years of injury in the specific shape of institutional preference. And I waited for someone who might actually listen. The sound of the courtyard drill continued below them, regular and relentless, the instructor's voice carrying the count forward, students moving in practiced unison toward the part of the curriculum that was waiting for them like a door that opened the wrong way. You picked up the folder Min-jun had set down and opened it again, reading this time not as a formal document but as evidence. He read in silence for several minutes. When he closed it, he placed it to one side very deliberately, separate from the others. There are more of these, he said. Not just 8 years. Min-jun nodded. I suspect the earlier records have different formatting. The language changes after a certain point. Around 12 years ago, the phrasing in the reports becomes much more standardized. Standardized, you repeated. Yes, Min-jun said. Like someone decided on a particular way to describe a particular kind of event. You looked at him across the table for a moment with an expression that Min-jun would only understand later, when he was older, as a man recognizing the distance between what he had believed an institution was and what the evidence was telling him it had been. The technique is mandatory, you said. Every student in the academy will pass through it this term. Yes, Min-jun said. Including the current intake cohort. Including the ones being prepared for advanced formation testing. The sound of the courtyard below. Count 2, hold, release, count 3, hold, release, the beat steady and unhurried, the system working as designed, the machinery turning without anyone at the door counting what came out the other side. You placed both hands flat on the table. He looked at the separate folder. Then he looked at Min-jun, and this time there was no assessment in the look. No testing. Only the flat weight of a man who has just confirmed that what he feared was real and is now working out how to carry it. "If you are right," he said quietly. His voice had dropped to the register of a statement made in a room where the walls might be listening. "If this is what the records show, then what we have is not a training accident. What we have is a curriculum that has been doing this reliably and consistently for at least 2 decades. He paused. "And that means someone approved it. And someone reviewed it. And someone filed these reports." Min-jun said nothing. He did not need to. The silence between them held the shape of the answer perfectly without requiring either of them to say it aloud. Outside, the courtyard instructor called the next beat. The students moved. The technique continued. The academy ran on, and the change came quietly, the way the academy preferred all of its uncomfortable shifts to happen. No announcement, no visible consequence, no moment a person could point to and say, "That was when they decided to watch us." But the watching began. Min-jun felt it first in the storeroom. Someone had been through his corner of the basement storage area, not destructively, not obviously, but with the specific tidiness of a person searching carefully and returning everything just slightly wrong. The soap crates were moved 2 inches closer together than he kept them. The folded blanket on his sleeping shelf had been refolded along a different crease. His small wrapped bundle of notes, the pages he had accumulated from 3 years of observation and careful memory, which he kept under a loose floor brick near the drain, had not been touched. But the brick had been pressed back too firmly, as if someone had lifted it, found nothing immediately obvious, and replaced it with more care than it deserved. He did not move the notes. Moving them would confirm that he knew about the search. Instead, he spent the next 2 evenings memorizing what was written on each page and then burning them one at a time in the furnace, so that what he needed most was only inside his head, where nobody could file it, confiscate it, or make it disappear with a standardized notation. That same week, the archive assistant on the 3rd corridor stopped nodding to Eugene Tae when they passed. This was a small thing. The academy ran on small things. Acknowledgement was a resource distributed according to alignment. When it stopped flowing between 2 people, it meant someone had noted the connection and registered a warning without needing to speak it aloud. "You told Min-jun this in the equipment room one afternoon," stated flatly, without drama, the way he communicated everything that mattered. "Someone in the administrative division is aware of our access to the lower incident reports. Not the content. Probably only the access itself." He paused. "That is enough, for certain purposes." "What purposes?" "The kind that don't require proof. Only proximity." Min-jun understood. He had grown up in the lowest layer of the academy's social architecture. He knew precisely how proximity worked as evidence when the person in proximity had no rank to protect them. 3 days after that conversation, his work assignment was audited without explanation, and 2 items in the equipment inventory he was responsible for came up short on count. Both items were old, broken, and had been listed as damaged awaiting disposal for the previous 4 months. The quartermaster reviewed the discrepancy with the deliberate, theatrical concern of a man performing diligence rather than practicing it, and then noted the deficiency in Min-jun's service record. Nothing more was said. Nothing more needed to be. That was how the institution communicated with people it could not formally discipline, through small accumulations, small marks, small inconveniences that added up over time to a record that justified whatever decision had already been made about you. Min-jun noted all of it in the only ledger left to him, which was his memory, and he continued to work, and he continued to watch, because stopping would cost more than continuing. What troubled him more than the surveillance was what he had discovered in the weeks since the next session with you. He had expected the injury pattern to be invisible to most instructors. What he found instead, through careful observation during practice sessions he was not supposed to be watching and overheard conversations he was not supposed to be hearing, was something considerably worse. The pattern was not invisible. It was familiar. 3 times in 2 weeks Min-jun witnessed practice sessions where a student exhibited early signs of load deviation exactly consistent with the progression he had identified in the records. Each time, the instructor's response was not alarm or intervention. It was an adjustment of tone and pace that communicated, without words, the expectation that the student would push through. After one session, he heard two senior assistants discussing a student who had been removed to the healer's wing at midpoint. Their conversation lasted approximately 90 seconds. Neither of them suggested that the technique might be the problem. One of them said that the student had shown promise but had lacked final consolidation. The other agreed. They walked away discussing the afternoon schedule. This was the thing that replaced the landscape underneath Minjun's analysis and made it heavier in a different way than it had been before. The injury pattern was not unknown. It was normalized. The assumption built into the curriculum was not that students would pass safely through this technique. The assumption was that the strongest would survive it, the weakest would be identified by their failure to survive it, and that this was an acceptable and perhaps even useful mechanism for determining who should proceed. The system was not malfunctioning. The system was doing exactly what people at a certain level of it had decided a successful system should do. He was still carrying this understanding like a stone in his coat when he saw Lim Chaiwon for the first time. Chaiwon was 11, from a minor house with limited connection to the central formation families, enrolled in the lower cohort on academic scholarship rather than family sponsorship. He was small for his age and exceptionally careful in the specific way of children who have understood early that they cannot afford the cost of careless mistakes. Minjun noticed him during a cleaning shift because the boy had stayed behind after a formation session to practice the consolidation form alone, running through the sequence slowly, correcting himself with a seriousness that was almost painful to watch. He was talented. That was immediately apparent. Not spectacular, not the obvious first-rank brilliance that attracted teachers' attention from across the room, but the deep, precise, load-efficient talent that produces excellent outcomes in controlled conditions and dangerous ones when the conditions are wrong. Minjun came back to that corridor 3 times over the following week and watched Chaiwon practice alone. Each time the boy's form improved. Each time he advanced a little further into the full extension sequence. Each time he reached slightly closer to the point that the records had taught Minjun to recognize as the border where the technique became unreliable. On the 4th day, Minjun waited until the corridor was empty except for Chaiwon packing up his practice materials and said, "Don't go past the 3rd hold." Chaiwon looked at him with the instant wariness of a scholarship student who had learned that unsolicited attention from strangers usually meant an attempt to destabilize or humiliate. "Sorry? The consolidation form. Don't push it past the 3rd hold extension. When you feel the load seat fully at the 3rd point, stop there." Chaiwon studied him. He took in the service uniform, the ash-stained cuffs, the absence of any academic insignia. "You're a cleaner," he said. Not unkindly. Just precisely. "Yes. You don't have mana." "No. So you can't actually feel what the form does." "I can see what it does," Minjun said. "To people who have mana and use it well and push the form past the 3rd hold." He held Chaiwon's gaze. "It hurts them. Specifically. Not because they're weak. Because they're precise enough to reach the part that's wrong." Chaiwon was quiet for a moment. He had the face of a child doing rapid calculation, weighing something unfamiliar against something it could not yet categorize. Then he said, "Instructor Beck told us the form has to be completed to full extension for the credit assessment." "I know. If I don't complete the full extension, you won't get the credit mark." "Yes." Minjun picked up the cleaning pail he had set down to speak to him. "I'm telling you anyway. Because not getting the credit mark is recoverable." He looked at Chaiwon once more. "The other thing isn't always." He walked away without waiting for a response, because waiting would have produced another question he could not answer safely in an open corridor, and because he already knew what the answer to that question would be. Chaiwon was a scholarship student. Refusing to complete a mandatory assessment was not a realistic option for him. The credit mark was not optional. The risk was not something he could decline by choosing a different path. He was going to push the form to full extension because the institution that fed him and housed him and provided him the only path available to him had told him to, and that was the architecture of what the Academy had built, quietly and systematically, over 20 years of sorted, normalized injury records. The assessment session for Chaiwon's cohort was scheduled 4 days later. Minjun knew this because the practice hall scheduling was posted on the service corridor board, which he passed twice a day. He told you what he had told Chaiwon. You listened without interruption and then was silent for longer than usual. I cannot intervene in a scheduled assessment, he said finally. Not without documentation of specific cause and not without risking a formal inquiry into my basis for the intervention. Minjun said nothing. If I flag one student without institutional justification, the investigation will focus on the flag rather than on what caused it. It will also reveal to administrative oversight that I have been reviewing the lower incident records. I understand, Minjun said. He did. Understanding the logic of the trap did not make it smaller. Is there anything you can do? You looked at him steadily. I can be present near the wing during the assessment. That was all. Minjun spent the following 3 days completing his assigned duties with the controlled efficiency of someone who had no energy left to waste on anything that did not directly matter. He hauled ash. He replaced lamp wicks. He mopped the east corridor tiles in the cold gray hours before the academy woke. At night he lay on his sleeping shelf behind the soap crates and ran through the injury progression, the load deviation points, the specific moment in the form where strong channelers hit the structural flaw, trying to find something he had missed, some error in the analysis, some variable that would make him wrong. He did not find one. He found himself hoping he was wrong, which was different and worse. The assessment happened in the late afternoon. Minjun was supposed to be in the sub-basement doing drainage clearance. Instead he was in the service corridor outside the practice wing, listening through the wall, because the wall was old plasterwork over hollow internal framing and sounds carried through it clearly if you stood in the right position, which he had known about since he was 8. He heard the assessment proceed normally through the first 2 cohort members. He heard the third, who stumbled at the second hold and had to restart, which was reported neutrally and added to the record. He heard the fourth, who was very good, clean and precise, moving through the form with the exact quality of controlled talent that Minjun had seen in Chaiwon. He heard the instructor's approval. He heard the 5th step into position. He heard Lim Chaiwon's name called. He listened to the breathing exercise before the form. He listened to the first hold, clean. The second hold, stable. The third hold, precise. His hands pressed flat against the plaster. Come back. Stop there. Just stop there. He heard Chaiwon push to full extension. He heard the form seat into place with the high, clear tone of a channeling engagement done correctly by someone who was genuinely excellent at this. For 1 second it held. Then it didn't. The sound was not an explosion. It was quieter than the hall fire had been. A sharp crack, like wood splitting deep in the grain, and then a sound that was not magical at all, just a child's sound, pain and surprise without the breath to shape either of them properly, and then the scrape of something heavy hitting the floor. Then voices, controlled urgency, someone calling for a healer, someone telling the remaining students to stay calm and hold position, the specific competent noise of people managing a crisis they had managed before and expected to manage again. Minjun stood with his forehead against the cold plasterwork and did not move for a long time. You found him there 20 minutes later. He stood beside him for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "The boy will recover. Partial disruption to the channeling structure in the left side median flow path. The healer estimates a 4-month recovery. He will retain basic function. But not full function," Minjun said. Not competition-level precision. Not the kind the scholarship requires. Probably not, you said. He said it quietly, without softening it, which was the one form of respect he consistently extended to Minjun that the rest of the academy withheld. They stood in the corridor together for another moment. From somewhere in the practice wing came the sound of the assessment continuing. The form being demonstrated. The counts being called. The machinery completing its cycle. I told him, Minjun said. I know, you said. He was never going to stop, Minjun said. No, you agreed. He was never going to stop. The hallway smelled of cold plaster and lamp oil and the faint chemical residue of channeling discharge still drifting through the thin wall from the wing beyond. Minjun stepped back from the wall. His reflection in the dark window glass at the end of the corridor was barely visible, small, thin, ash-marked, standing in a service hallway in the building where he had lived his entire conscious life, surrounded by the machinery of an institution that processed children like raw material and called the output excellence. You spoke behind him, his voice quiet and careful in a way it had not been before. I want to see everything you've gathered. Not a summary. Everything. Minjun turned to look at him. There was something different in the instructor's expression now, different from the analytical precision of the next sessions and different from the controlled competence of the post-explosion hall. It was the expression of a man who had just watched a thing he understood intellectually become a thing he understood physically, in his chest, where it could not be argued with or filed away. I burned most of it, Minjun said. What I have left is here. He touched the side of his head. You looked at him for a moment. Then we'll write it down again, he said. Together this time. Properly. Minjun nodded once. At the far end of the service corridor, a door opened and a healer's aide moved quickly past carrying a folded stretcher. Nobody looked in their direction. They were standing in a maintenance corridor in the lower service wing, two people the academy had no particular reason to pay attention to. A boy without mana and a field instructor past his institutional prime, standing in the dark between other people's broken things, beginning to build something the building did not want built. There is one more thing, Minjun said. The technique. Where did it come from originally? You was quiet for a beat too long. It was formalized during a curriculum revision approximately 22 years ago, he said. The committee that approved it is still largely represented in the current senior faculty structure. He paused. Why? Minjun looked back at the wall, through which the sound of another student completing the form now came, clean, precise, talented, pushing the load to exactly the point where the flaw was waiting. Because if someone approved it after it had already produced injury results, he said, then we are not looking for an accident. He turned to face you fully. We are looking for a decision. The folders you brought to the annex the following evening were older than the ones Minjun had read before. The paper was different, heavier stock that had warped slightly with age and repeated temperature changes, and the ink had faded to the brown-gray of old tea in certain sections, forcing Minjun to tilt the pages toward the lamp to read them. You had carried them in a plain cloth sack, the kind used for transporting laundry, which was either careful concealment or the most honest description of what the Academy's oldest records had become, dirty linen, badly folded, stored somewhere nobody checked too often. They worked in silence for the first hour. You read one pile. Minjun read another. The annex smelled of cold stone and old paper and the faint animal smell of the lamp oil burning down. Outside, the academy settled into its night rhythms, distant bell counts, the patrol footsteps of corridor supervisors, the occasional low voice of senior students moving between study rooms. None of it came near the records annex, which had the particular invisibility of spaces that held nothing valuable by any measure the institution currently recognized. Minjun sorted the documents as he read them, not by date, which would have been the obvious method, but by injury type, because injury type was the through line that connected everything regardless of which year or which instructor or which cohort level the report had originated from. He built 4 groups on the table surface, pushing the lamp back to make room, separating the records into the categories he had already identified and one new one that was emerging from the older material. The new category was the most interesting and the most disturbing. It was documents where the language was different. Not simply older or less polished. Different in kind. The early reports, from the period roughly 15 to 22 years prior, used specific anatomical language for the injuries that the more recent documents had replaced with administrative abstraction. Where a current report said disruption of internal flow regulation, an older one said fracture of the left median consolidation pathway. Where a current report said adverse response to upper load channeling, an older one said collapse of the third extension node under full load engagement. The older language was more precise, more clinical, more useful for anyone actually trying to understand what had happened to the student in question. It was the language of people documenting a problem so that it could be solved. At some point, that language had been replaced with language designed to document a problem so that it could be filed. Minjun set the two types side by side and stared at them for long enough that you looked up from his own reading. "Show me," you said. Minjun turned both documents toward him without speaking. You read them both. He read the older one twice. His face did not change in any dramatic way. It was more a slight forward movement of his attention, like a man leaning into wind. "The terminology revision," he said. "I know when that happened," you said slowly. The documentation standards were updated as part of the same curriculum committee review that standardized the consolidation technique. He set the papers down very carefully, the way people set things down when they need their hands free but do not want to show that they need their hands free. "The same review." Minjun said nothing. The same review that formalized the technique had also changed the language used to describe its damage. That was the shape of it. Clean. Administratively invisible unless you held both documents from both sides of the revision date in the same physical space and read them consecutively, which required access to both archives and the specific kind of motivation that only came from already suspecting what you would find. He returned to his reading pile and continued sorting. 20 minutes later he found the first significant anomaly in the date sequence. It was a document that should not have been where it was. By the filing system's own internal logic, based on the archival notation in the upper right corner, this report belonged in the section for academic year 7 of the previous decade. Instead it was tucked inside the folder for academic year 3, between two entirely unrelated supply manifests, as if placed there by someone in a hurry or placed there deliberately by someone who understood that hurry was a useful aesthetic when you needed to hide something in plain sight. The document itself was an injury report for a single student. The student's name was given only by initials and cohort designation, which was unusual. Every other report in the collection used full names. The injury described was severe, one of the most severe in the entire pile, a complete pathway collapse at the third extension node during a full cohort assessment, resulting in permanent loss of active channeling capacity. Total. Not partial, not recoverable, not a 4-month rehabilitation the way Chaiwan's injury had been described. Total. The student was 13 years old at the time of the incident. The date of the report was 11 days before the curriculum committee had formally approved the consolidation technique as standard mandatory practice. 11 days before it became the technique every student passed through. 11 days before the language revision that turned fracture into disruption and collapse into adverse response. Minjun read the date 3 times. He turned the lamp higher, ignoring the way it guttered and threw shadows up the shelving. He checked the document's archival notation against the folder it had been hidden inside. He checked the handwriting style against 2 other documents from the same period. He checked the ink color and the paper weight. Everything confirmed what the date confirmed. This student had been permanently, completely injured by the consolidation technique 11 days before the academy officially made that technique mandatory. He set the document down in the center of the table between himself and you and said, "Look at the date." You leaned forward. He looked at the date. He looked at it for a long time. He did not say anything immediately. In the corridor outside, a bell rang twice for the late hour. Neither of them moved. The committee review concluded with formal approval on the 15th, you said eventually, his voice very quiet and very level. This report is dated the 4th. Yes, Minjun said. The technique injured this student catastrophically on or before the 4th. The committee approved it as mandatory practice on the 15th. 11 days later. He touched the edge of the document, not picking it up. Which means at least some members of the committee knew this had happened before they signed the approval. You sat back. He looked at the ceiling briefly, the reflex of a man recalibrating the scale of something he had been measuring in the wrong units. You don't know that they knew, he said. The report was misfiled. Yes, Minjun said. After the approval date, or before it? Yu was quiet. If this report was misfiled before the approval vote, Minjun continued, keeping his voice as flat and factual as he could manage, then the injury was hidden from the committee and the approval was made in ignorance. If it was misfiled after the approval vote, then someone had access to both the injury report and the approved documentation, and chose to bury the connection. He looked at Yu. Both explanations are bad. One is worse. Yu stood up and moved to the window, which overlooked nothing but a dark interior courtyard, but which gave him somewhere to look that was not the document. Minjun waited. He was getting better at waiting. 3 years of service work had given him a functional expertise in the particular patients required to exist inside systems that moved on their own schedules regardless of urgency. The report is initialed at the bottom, Yu said without turning. 3 initials. A reviewing signature. Yes. One of those initials belongs to a member of the current senior faculty. Minjun had noticed this also. He had not said it first because he wanted to hear whether you would say it or not. The fact that you said it told him something important. The instructor was not looking for a way out of the implication. He was looking directly at it. Which member? Minjun said. It was not quite a question. You turned back to the table. He picked up the document and looked at the initials for a long moment. Then he set it down in the separate pile, the pile that Minjun had designated for records that needed to be kept apart from the general analysis, because they required something different, a different kind of careful handling. The initials are KSH, you said. There is one faculty member with those initials currently active in the Academy's formal academic structure. He did not say the name. Saying the name would be a specific and irreversible act. They both understood this. The consolidation technique is taught primarily in the 3rd and 4th formation cohorts, Minjun said instead. Who has authority over the 3rd and 4th cohort curriculum? Yu's jaw tightened slightly. The Senior Formation Division Coordinator. Yes, Minjun said. And the Senior Formation Division Coordinator has held that position for how long? 14 years, you said. 14 years. Longer than Minjun had been alive. Long enough that the normalized injury language, the misfiled report, the approved technique, and the person with signing authority over the curriculum were not separate events from separate eras. They were all the same era, all the same structure, all the same building with all the same walls. Minjun straightened the pile in front of him and said, I want to see the records from further back. Before this review period. The ones from 20 years ago, before the language changed. Those records may not be in this annex, you said. No, Minjun agreed. I know where they would be. You looked at him. The closed archive in the administration wing. The closed archive was not called the closed archive officially. Officially it was the Historical Documentation Repository, which was a name designed to make access requests sound like scholarship inquiries rather than investigations. It held the Academy's complete administrative history from its founding, including all committee records, full injury documentation predating the language revision, and personnel files. Access required a formal application, a faculty sponsor, and approval from the Senior Administrative Office. None of which Minjun had. I can't apply for access, he said. No, you agreed. And I cannot apply for access to historical injury records without making a formal statement of purpose that will reach the same administrative office whose senior personnel appear in these documents. He paused. Which means the access itself would be visible to the people we're investigating before we have enough to justify the investigation to anyone who could protect us. They looked at each other across the table. The lamp was burning lower now, the oil running thin, the light beginning to flatten and yellow. The stacked folders around them cast small square shadows. There's another way in, Minjun said. You studied him. The service tunnel system, Minjun said. The administrative wing east wall connects to the old heating infrastructure. There's a maintenance access passage that runs behind the historical repository's internal storage wall. I've been in it before, during boiler inspection work. That passage requires a current service authorization to enter during non-maintenance periods, you said carefully. Yes, Min-jun said. I know. He also knew that the service authorization log was maintained by the same quartermaster who had recently added 2 fictional inventory discrepancies to his work record. He knew that the log itself was updated by hand in a ledger that was stored in an unlocked cabinet in the service corridor station. He knew that the handwriting verification on service entries was cursory at best, because the staff who reviewed it were looking for obvious forgeries by students trying to skip drills, not for alterations by a 10-year-old who had been watching the authorization process for 3 years and knew exactly what a legitimate entry looked like. He did not say all of this to you. He said only, I can manage the authorization question. I need you to be somewhere visible and accounted for during the window. You looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man deciding how much he was willing to know about a plan he was not officially part of. It was a specific expression, somewhere between professional distance and personal complicity, and Min-jun had begun to recognize it as the closest thing to trust the instructor currently had available. When? You asked. 3 days, Min-jun said. The boiler system is scheduled for its monthly pressure check on the 14th. That gives me a legitimate reason to be in the service tunnel regardless of what the authorization log says. You nodded once. He began restacking the folders with the methodical care of someone returning a space to a state of plausible innocence. Min-jun helped him. They worked quietly, organizing the evidence of 20 years of institutional damage back into the anonymous file folders that had been its camouflage, pressing the documents flat, readying the cord closures, making everything look undisturbed. The oldest report, the one with the initials and the impossible date, you folded into his inside coat pocket without comment. Min-jun let this happen and said nothing. Some evidence needed to be in a place more secure than an annex that someone had already been watching. When they finished, you took the lamp and Min-jun carried the cloth sack to the door. The corridor beyond was empty and dark, the late-hour quiet of a building that believed it was not being examined. The boy, Min-jun said before you could turn away. Lim Chai-won. What happens to his scholarship? Yu's face did not change, but something in the set of his shoulders did. His channeling assessment results will reflect the disruption. The scholarship committee reviews incomplete assessments quarterly. Meaning? Meaning in most cases, a student who cannot complete full formation assessment within the scholarship's defined period is reclassified as a general residential student, with associated cost implications for their sponsoring household. He doesn't have a sponsoring household, Min-jun said. He has an academic merit allocation. Yes, you said. I know. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere far above them, in the upper academic wings, the life of the institution continued with its usual confident noise. Cohort rankings were being posted. Evening study sessions were ending. Senior students were debating fine points of formation theory in warm, well-lit rooms full of people who would never need to stand in a service corridor and count the cost of what the academy had decided was a normal outcome. He was never going to be able to stop, Min-jun said again. He was not sure why he kept returning to this. Perhaps because it was the most precise injustice in a system built from imprecise ones. Chai-won had done everything correctly. He had been talented and disciplined and careful, and the academy had used exactly those qualities to bring him to exactly the point where its own structural flaw would damage him most thoroughly. No, you said, as he had said before. He wasn't. Min-jun shifted the cloth sack under his arm. Then we need to find everything, he said. Not just the technique. Not just the one review. All of it. How far back it goes, how many students, who knew, who signed, who filed. He looked at you steadily, 10 years old, soot-stained, without mana or family or a single formal credential to his name. Because this isn't one bad decision buried in the records. He looked back down the annex corridor toward the shelf where the folders sat in their returned places, waiting. Someone decided what the records would say. And then they decided what the technique would do. And those were not the same person making 2 separate mistakes. He paused. Those were the same structure making one very long, very consistent choice. You looked at him for a moment in the low lamplight. 3 days, he said. The 14th. Yes, Min-jun said. He walked away down the service corridor, carrying the empty cloth sack, moving quietly through the dark spaces between other people's certainties, toward the boiler room and the heating tunnels and the wall that stood between him and 20 years of carefully buried truth. The 14th arrived the way dangerous days always arrived in Min-jun's experience, looking exactly like any other day until it didn't. The morning shift went normally. He hauled ash from the east furnace block, replaced 2 lamp wicks in the lower administrative corridor, and signed the standard boiler inspection form at the service station in handwriting careful enough to be legible and ordinary enough to be forgettable. The authorization log entry he had added 3 nights earlier, working by the light of a single stub candle in the service station while the corridor supervisor was on his far end round, looked exactly as it should. It said what legitimate entries said. It was signed with the abbreviated notation that boiler inspection crew leads used. Anyone checking it would see a scheduled maintenance access entry for the heating infrastructure, unremarkable, consistent with the quarterly pressure check calendar that had been posted on the service board for 2 weeks. Nobody checked it. That was the thing about service infrastructure documentation. It existed to protect the institution from liability, not to track the movements of people the institution did not consider worth tracking. Min-jun finished his morning assignment 12 minutes early, which gave him the window he needed. He moved through the east wing without hurrying, carrying the boiler inspection satchel that every service worker used for heating system checks, a flat canvas bag worn at the straps and smelling of grease and metal filings, the kind of object that made a person invisible in a service corridor the way a ledger made a person invisible at a desk. The entrance to the heating infrastructure was a low iron door set into the east wall of the sub-basement, secured with a padlock whose key hung on a numbered hook in the service station along with 17 other identical keys for 17 other identical padlocks throughout the building's maintenance system. Min-jun had copied the relevant key number from the inspection calendar 2 weeks prior. He unlocked the door, stepped through, pulled it closed behind him, and stood for a moment in the dark, letting his eyes adjust. The heating tunnel was narrow and warm and smelled of old brick and pipe scale and the specific dry heat of flue gases that had been moving through the same channels for decades. The passage ran in both directions from the entry point, curving along the building's outer foundation wall. To the left was the main boiler chamber. To the right was the path he needed, the older section of the heating infrastructure that predated the academy's last major renovation and ran along the back wall of the administrative wing's internal storage sections, including the historical documentation repository. He went right. The tunnel was low enough in places that he had to duck, and dark enough throughout that he kept one hand on the wall and counted his paces. He had been in this section twice before during actual maintenance work and had spent both visits memorizing the layout with the systematic attention he gave to any space where knowing the geography might eventually matter. 43 paces from the entry door, the tunnel widened slightly at a junction with a secondary flue channel. 61 paces from the entry door, there was a section of wall where the brick had been replaced at some point with a different material, slightly lighter in color, a repair patch from a period of water infiltration damage. 88 paces from the entry door, the tunnel turned sharply right, and the wall on the left side changed character entirely. Here the original heating infrastructure had been built directly against the foundation wall of the administrative wing, and in the space where the two building phases met there was a section of the wall that had never been fully sealed. Not a gap, not an opening, but a point where the mortar between courses had shrunk and cracked over decades of thermal cycling until it was possible, for someone small and patient, to work loose 3 specific bricks in a specific sequence and access the crawl space behind, which opened, eventually, into the subfloor cavity beneath the historical documentation repository's internal storage room. Min-jun had found this during his first boiler inspection visit, at age 9, when he had been small enough to press close to every wall and curious enough to notice what the adults around him were too large and too important to bother noticing. He had not used it then. He had simply noted it, filed it, and waited, because patience was the only resource he had in surplus. He worked the 3 bricks loose now, set them carefully on the tunnel floor, and pushed himself through the gap into the crawl space beyond. The crawl space smelled of old wood and cold dust and the particular airless quality of spaces that had not been breathed in for years. It was perhaps 40 centimeters high, running under the repository's floor joists, and he moved through it on his elbows with the controlled care of someone who understood that noise traveled upward through wooden floors with remarkable fidelity. Above him, through the boards, he could hear nothing. The repository was not a regularly staffed space. It was accessed by appointment, and there were no appointments scheduled on boiler inspection days because boiler inspection days were deliberately avoided by administrative staff, who disliked the smell of flue discharge that sometimes reached the upper corridors. Min-jun had checked the appointment ledger, which was posted outside the repository door on the third floor, on each of the 3 days preceding the 14th. He found the access hatch in the floor of a supply cabinet built into the repository's storage room, a cabinet that had originally been a dumbwaiter shaft before the renovation had sealed the lower portion and converted the upper section to shelving. The hatch opened with pressure from below, a simple gravity latch, and he eased it up a centimeter at a time, listening at each stage, until it was open enough to see through. Storage room. Shelf units. Boxes and bound folders. No people. He pushed the hatch fully open and climbed through. The historical documentation repository's internal storage room was smaller than he had expected and more ordered than he had hoped. The shelving was labeled in the Academy's formal archival notation, which he had taught himself to read from the index cards posted outside the public access annex. He moved through the room reading labels, touching nothing yet, building the geography of the space in the same way he built the geography of every space, methodically, quietly, by looking before reaching. The folders he needed were in the section designated Pre-Revision Administrative Records, which was shelved in the back half of the room behind a set of newer record boxes that had been placed in front of it, not blocking access but making it slightly inconvenient, the specific inconvenience of something not actively hidden but not actively displayed either. He pulled the first relevant box and opened it on the floor beside the hatch, working by the thin line of light that came through the high frosted glass window at the room's far end. The documents inside were older than anything in the annex, the paper genuinely brittle in places, the handwriting of 3 or 4 different individuals across different years. He read quickly and carefully, moving pages from one side of the box to the other as he processed them, keeping his hands steady and his breathing slow. What he found in the first box was the oldest layer of injury documentation, from the period 15 to 25 years prior, and it confirmed everything the annex records had suggested. Before the language revision, the records spoke plainly. Students had been injured by the consolidation technique's full extension phase with a consistency that was, in the language of the older documents, noted as a pattern of concern. One document, a working memo from an internal review session, used the phrase structural load ceiling exceeded as a description of what happened to strong channelers at full extension, and it used that phrase not as a shocking discovery but as an established working concept, meaning the people in that room already knew what the technique did and were discussing its implications as a known quantity. Min-jun moved to the second box. Here the documents became denser and more interesting, because this was the period immediately surrounding the curriculum committee review, and the material was no longer just injury records. There were draft committee minutes, internal correspondence, a set of revised technique specifications with handwritten margin notes, and, tucked inside a folder labeled Miscellaneous Preliminary Materials, a set of letters between 2 individuals whose names he did not immediately recognize but whose institutional positions were listed in the letter headers, one from the Senior Academic Review Board, one from the Formation Division Advisory Panel. The letters were about the technique. They were about the injury pattern. They were about what to do with a curriculum component that produced reliable injury in a specific population subset, that subset being the most talented and precisely trained students. The language was careful and formal and institutional, but underneath the formality the exchange was absolutely clear. Both writers knew the technique was dangerous. Both writers knew the danger was concentrated in the students most likely to execute the technique with maximum precision. The exchange across the letters was not about whether to fix the technique or remove it. The exchange was about how to frame the injuries so that the pattern would not aggregate visibly in the formal record, and about how to revise the documentation standards so that the clinical specificity of the older language, which made the pattern legible, would be replaced with administrative abstraction that made each case look isolated. Min-jun stopped breathing for a moment when he understood what he was reading. He had known, intellectually, from the moment he had seen the 2 document types side by side in the annex, that the language revision had been deliberate. He had said as much to you. But knowing a thing analytically and reading the conversation in which 2 institutional officials decide to do it are separated by a distance that only evidence crosses. He was across that distance now. He set the letters aside with the particular careful movement of someone handling something that matters. He kept reading. The third box held older material still, from the period the annex had not covered, and here the picture deepened in a direction he had not fully anticipated. The injury pattern was not 20 years old. The documents in this box went back 30 years, and the same basic injury profile appeared in them, under different language again, the language of an even earlier period that was more direct than either the current administrative euphemism or the intermediate clinical precision. 30 years ago, someone had written in a formal post-incident review that the third extension note of the consolidation form represented a predictable failure point under full engagement conditions and recommended either modification of the technique or a ceiling on the extension phase in student practice. The recommendation was noted. There was a date stamp on the next document showing it had been received and logged. There was no subsequent document showing it had been acted upon. 30 years. The recommendation to fix the technique or limit its application had been filed 30 years ago. The technique had continued unchanged. Minjun looked at the stack of documents around him on the floor of the storage room and felt the full shape of what he had found settle into place with the cold, geometric clarity of something that could not be argued with. This was not a case of institutional blindness. This was not a series of oversights compounding over time. The Academy had been told, in writing, 30 years ago, that this technique injured students at the extension point. The Academy had chosen to continue using the technique. It had continued using it through 2 subsequent curriculum reviews, through a language revision specifically designed to obscure the injury pattern, through 20 years of individual injury reports that each said one student failed while the cumulative record said the technique was working exactly as its structural logic required it to work. Then a sound reached him from somewhere above, through the ceiling of the storage room, footsteps in the corridor outside the repository door, 2 sets, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who belonged where they were walking. He went still. The footsteps stopped outside the door. He heard the sound of the latch being tested, the brief metallic tick of someone trying the handle from the corridor side. The repository door was locked. He knew it was locked because the key was on the same board as the boiler keys and the lock notation on the appointment ledger showed no key sign out for today. The handle released. The footsteps continued past. Minjun waited for a count of 60 before he moved again. He worked quickly now, selecting the most critical documents, the letters between the 2 officials, the 30-year-old recommendation and its unanswered date stamp, the draft committee minutes with handwritten margin notes, the folder of pre-revision injury records that used the clear clinical language. He could not take the physical documents. Taking them would leave gaps in the boxes that would be found during any subsequent access, and gaps were evidence of a specific and traceable removal. Instead, he read each selected document a second time with the focused, sequential attention he had trained himself to use since childhood, encoding the content in the layered way the archive had taught him, page by page, sentence by sentence, fact by fact. He was not memorizing. He was building a second record. One that could not be filed, cannot be revised, and could not be misfiled into the wrong folder by someone in a hurry or someone with a reason to make a connection disappear. When he had what he needed, he returned every document to its position, closed every box with the same orientation it had held when he opened it, smoothed the floor where he had knelt so that the dust pattern was not obviously disturbed, and lowered himself back through the hatch. He pulled the hatch closed above him, moved through the crawl space, emerged into the heating tunnel, replaced the 3 bricks, and walked back down the passage counting his paces in reverse, 88, 61, 43, until he reached the iron door, let himself out, locked it behind him, and stood in the sub-basement corridor with the inspection satchel over his shoulder, looking like exactly what his authorization log entry said he was, a service worker completing a routine boiler pressure check on a scheduled maintenance day. He stood there for a moment. The corridor smelled of coal dust and cold stone and the distant cafeteria smell of whatever was being prepared in the kitchens above. Ordinary academy smell. The smell of a building that had been running on the same architecture for 30 years, human and institutional both, and had learned to experience its own design as natural. He began walking toward the stairwell. He had everything he had gone in to find, and several things he had not expected to find, and one specific phrase from one specific letter that was sitting at the center of his thinking like a coal in ash, still hot, not yet cooling. The phrase was from the second official's final letter in the exchange, written in the period immediately before the language revision, in response to the first official's proposal for documentation standardization. The second official had agreed with the proposal. He had said it was the correct institutional response to a pattern that could not be eliminated without restructuring a foundational element of the formation curriculum. And then he had added, in the plain, considered language of someone who understood exactly what he was agreeing to, a single sentence that Minjun now carried out of the archive inside him like a document that had never been officially filed. The sentence said, "The alternative is acknowledgement, and acknowledgement at this stage would require us to account for everyone the current system has already processed." Minjun climbed the stairs toward the light, carrying 30 years of institutional decision-making in his memory, and thought about the word processed, and thought about Lim Chaiwan's left hand, and thought about the list of students who had been transferred and the students who had been reclassified and the students whose names appeared once in an injury report and never again in any subsequent document, and he thought, "I know what the alternative is. I am going to make it." His name was Kang Hyun Seo, and he was everything the academy had built itself to produce. 17 years old, first ranked in the advanced formation cohort for 3 consecutive terms, from a house whose name appeared on the academy's founding donor wall in the entrance hall, carved in stone at a height that required you to look up to read it, which was not an accident of architectural planning. He moved through the academy's corridors the way water moved through a channel built specifically for it, without friction, without adjustment, without the small constant negotiations that everyone else performed just to exist in the same spaces. Minjun had been watching him for 2 weeks without intending to, the way you watched anything that kept appearing in your peripheral vision at moments of consequence. Hyun Seo had been at the back of the practice hall during the explosion. He had been in the corridor outside the annex twice during periods when Minjun and you were working inside. He had been 3 positions away at the equipment station when Minjun received the revised work assignment that moved him to the sub-basement. These could all be coincidences. The academy was not a large building. People recurred. But Hyun Seo recurred with a specific quality of attention, a stillness that was not the inattention of a busy person passing through but the controlled inattention of someone who had been taught to observe without appearing to observe, and who was not yet quite good enough at it to fool someone who had been doing it from necessity since age 7. The first direct contact happened in the East Yard, 3 days after the archive visit. Minjun was carrying a coal bucket through the yard's service edge when Hyun Seo stepped into his path. Not aggressively. Not with the theatrical cruelty of lesser bullies. Simply placed himself in the natural line of travel and waited, which forced Minjun to either stop or walk around him in a way that would look like avoidance. Minjun stopped. Hyun Seo looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has decided to be reasonable as a form of dominance. He was almost a full head taller. His uniform was immaculate. He had the hands of someone who had never carried a coal bucket and the eyes of someone who had never needed to. "You've been spending time with Instructor Yu," he said. His voice was level, not aggressive, which was its own kind of message. Statements delivered without aggression by people with more power than you were not observations. They were notices. "Instructor Yu assigned me to equipment maintenance in his section," Minjun said. This was technically true. You had arranged the assignment precisely so that Minjun's presence near his teaching areas had a formal justification. "Is that what it is?" Hyun Seo said. It was not a question. Minjun said nothing. "You caused a significant disruption to a lower cohort session 3 weeks ago," Hyun Seo said. "There are students still recovering in the healer wing because of the disruption to their concentration." The architecture of this statement was impressive in its way. It took the explosion, reversed the causation, attributed the damage to Minjun's intervention rather than to the technique that had caused the explosion, and delivered this reframing in the tone of a man reporting established facts. 2 students were recovering before my intervention," Minjun said. "They were recovering because the circle failed." "Circles fail when students lose concentration," Hyun Seo said. "Students lose concentration when unauthorized personnel scream in the middle of a precision exercise." Minjun adjusted the coal bucket to his other hand. "The anchor destabilized before I screamed," he said. "The sequence of events is in the incident report." "The incident report reflects Magister Han's formal account," Hyun Seo said. which I have read. He paused, giving the pause the weight of a man who has access to things others don't. Have you? Min Jun had. He had found the incident report on that bench 2 days after the explosion, but he did not say this. The incident report concludes with individual error, he said instead. Yes, Hyun Seo said. It does. He looked at Min Jun the way you look at something that is both smaller than you and continuing to speak when it should have stopped. You are a service worker with no mana, no academic standing, and no formal training in formation theory. You are 10 years old. You have already been given more patience than your position warrants. He stopped. Let that structure stand for a moment. What I would like to understand, he continued, is what exactly you believe you are doing. It was a good question, deployed at the right moment, designed to put Min Jun in the position of either justifying himself, which would sound defensive and grandiose, or admitting he was nothing, which was what the question was built to produce. Min Jun looked at Hyun Seo steadily. He thought of Chaiwon's left hand. He thought of the 30-year-old recommendation sitting unanswered in a box in the archive. He thought of the phrase the current system has already processed. My job, he said. He picked the coal bucket back up and walked around Hyun Seo and continued across the yard. He heard nothing behind him for a long moment. Then Hyun Seo said, to his back, quietly, be careful what you decide your job is. It was not a threat in any form that could be reported. It was a piece of advice, stated with genuine calm, from someone who understood exactly how systems worked and wanted to be on record as having warned you before they worked on you. Min Jun kept walking. The indirect campaign began the following day. It was not crude. Hyun Seo was too intelligent for crude, and in any case crude was unnecessary when you had the tools available to someone of his standing. What happened was a series of small environmental adjustments, each individually defensible, collectively architectural. A formal complaint was filed with the service administration noting that a cleaning worker had been observed in restricted equipment areas without a clear maintenance justification. The complaint was anonymous but used precise technical language, the language of someone who knew the service authorization system well enough to identify the right regulatory framework to invoke. Min Jun's recent equipment inventory discrepancies were attached. An assistant in the formation wing began requiring documentation for every service entry into the practice hall corridor, a requirement that had never previously existed and that applied, in practice, only to Min Jun, because everyone else had either a student credential or a faculty lanyard that served as automatic authorization. 2 senior students in Min Jun's residential section of the basement began spending time in the common areas in the evenings, not threatening, not confrontational, just present, the particular presence of people who have been placed somewhere to make a space feel observed. In the upper corridors, among the academic cohorts, the story of Min Jun's intervention during the explosion was being revised through repetition. He heard the current version from a first-year scholarship student who reported it with the confident specificity of someone passing on established information. The cleaning boy had panicked during a routine drill, his shouting had broken the lead student's concentration at a critical hold point, and the resulting injury to 2 students was a direct consequence of the interruption. The fact that no physical evidence supported this sequence did not matter. The sequence had been said enough times in enough different mouths that it had acquired the social weight of a fact, which in the Academy's internal culture was indistinguishable from an actual fact for most operational purposes. Min Jun documented all of it in his memory without responding to any of it directly, because responding would cost energy he needed for other things and because the institutional pressure was not the real danger. The real danger was the thing the pressure was designed to distract him from continuing. The confrontation Hyun Seo had apparently decided was necessary came 12 days after the East Yard encounter, in the form of a formal cohort review session to which Min Jun was, unexpectedly and without explanation, summoned. The summons came through the service administration office, which meant it had official form, and was signed by Magister Han, which meant it had institutional backing. The session was held in one of the middle teaching rooms, a space with tiers of seating on 3 sides and a flat demonstration area at the center, the kind of room designed to make the person at the center feel observed from every angle simultaneously. When Min Jun arrived, there were perhaps 30 people in the seats, a mix of senior and intermediate cohort students, 2 junior instructors, Magister Han at the front, and Hyun Seo seated in the elevated position reserved for cohort representatives, which gave him the geometry of the room in the same way that the technique gave skilled channelers the geometry of the formation, everything pointing toward him, everything structured to support his function. Magister Han opened the session with language that was technically neutral and practically accusatory. He said the session had been called to review certain claims being circulated through lower academy channels regarding formation curriculum safety, claims that had been causing unnecessary anxiety among junior cohort students and that required formal clarification. He said the academy took the safety of its students very seriously and that any substantive concerns should be raised through proper channels, and that informal circulation of unverified claims by unqualified individuals was not only procedurally incorrect but potentially harmful to the learning environment. He did not name Min-jun during this introduction. He did not need to. Everyone in the room was looking at Min-jun, who was standing at the service entry door in his ash-stained uniform, because he had not been given a seat. Hyun Seo spoke after Han. He spoke well, which was unsurprising. His argument was the institutional argument made with the fluency of someone who had grown up breathing institutional air. The Academy's curriculum had been developed and reviewed by the most qualified formation scholars available. Safety protocols were rigorously maintained. The injury rate in formation practice was consistent with the inherent challenge of the discipline and significantly lower than in unguided practice environments. The students who had been injured recently had received the best available care and were progressing toward recovery. The suggestion that there was a systemic flaw in the mandatory curriculum was not only unsupported by any qualified analysis but was the kind of claim that, if given credibility, would undermine student confidence in their training and potentially cause more harm than the supposed flaw itself. He made this case with calm, precise, compassionate language, the language of a person who genuinely believed that the institution was good, that its structures were sound, and that challenges to those structures from unqualified sources were a form of damage even when they were sincerely made. And this was the thing that made him genuinely dangerous rather than simply powerful. He was not entirely wrong. Min-jun stood at the service entry and felt the weight of the room, 30 faces, the architecture of tiers and elevated positions, the formal language of institutional process being used as a container for something that was not institutional process at all but something older and simpler, the collective pressure of a system trying to close around a point of rupture before the rupture could spread. Magister Han looked at him and said, "Do you have anything to say?" It was offered as a courtesy. The form of a fair process without the substance of one. Min-jun knew he could not win this room. He did not have the language or the standing or the credibility. Everything he said would be filtered through the story that had already been told about him, the cleaning boy who panicked, who spread rumors, who did not understand what he was looking at. He also knew that saying nothing would be interpreted as admission. So he said the one thing that could not be absorbed by the room's existing framework, because it was too specific to dismiss and too precise to misrepresent easily. "Can someone tell me," he said, "why the consolidation technique's third extension node produces injuries exclusively in students who are executing the form correctly?" The room was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of agreement. The silence of a system encountering a variable it had not prepared a response for. Hyun Seo's expression did not change. But for one brief, visible second, something moved behind his eyes, the involuntary adjustment of a person who has just heard a question they cannot answer with the tools they brought to the room. Magister Han spoke over the silence quickly. "This session is not a technical forum for unqualified speculation." But 2 of the junior instructors had glanced at each other. And one of the senior students in the back tier had leaned slightly forward. And Hyun Seo, for the first time since Min-jun had known of his existence, looked at him not as an inconvenience to be managed but as a problem of a different kind entirely. Min-jun was escorted from the room by a corridor supervisor 2 minutes later, formally, with the language of procedural compliance. He walked back to the service wing and picked up his afternoon duties and did not speak to anyone for the rest of the day. That evening, when he reached the space behind the soap crates that was the closest thing he had to private, he found a note on his sleeping shelf. It was written in a hand he did not recognize, on plain paper with no institutional notation, in the small careful script of someone who wrote infrequently or who was trying to disguise their hand. It said only, 3rd floor East Reading Room, after the second bell tonight. Come alone. Do not tell Eugene Tae. Min Jun read it twice. He held it over the lamp until it caught, then held the burning paper until it was entirely ash and dropped the ash into the cleaning bucket. He thought about the instruction not to tell you. He thought about Hyun Seo's face in the teaching room when the question landed. He thought about the 30 years of unanswered recommendations sitting in boxes in the archive. And he thought about the fact that if someone inside the institution had decided to reach out to him tonight specifically, the day after his question had made 2 junior instructors look at each other, then there were more people in this building who knew something than he had accounted for. He sat on his sleeping shelf in the dark for a long time, thinking about trust, which was a resource he had almost none of, and about risk, which he had more experience with than most adults twice his age. Then he picked up the boiler inspection satchel, which was the closest thing he owned to a reason to be in an upper corridor after the second bell, and began walking toward the stairs. The 3rd floor East Reading Room was used during the day by senior students working on independent formation theory projects. At night it held only the smell of old paper and cold lamp oil and the particular stillness of a room that had been full of concentrated human effort for many hours and was now empty of everything except its residue. Min Jun arrived 4 minutes after the second bell, which was late enough to confirm the space was not a trap requiring him to arrive first and early enough to suggest he had come with some degree of deliberate caution. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the boiler satchel over his shoulder and read the room the way he read every room, corners first, then the spaces behind furniture, then the quality of the light, then whether the dust on the floor near the window had been recently disturbed. The room was empty except for one person sitting at the far reading table with a single candle, facing the door with the body language of someone who had been waiting long enough to become calm about it. The person was old. Not elderly in the decorative way of senior faculty who wore age as additional authority, but old in the way of someone who had been used hard by time and had arrived at a functional accommodation with what remained. A man, perhaps 65, thin through the shoulders, with hands that rested flat on the table in a way that suggested either discipline or exhaustion and perhaps both. He wore no academic robe and no institutional insignia of any kind. His clothes were plain, the clothes of a person who had stopped needing to communicate affiliation through fabric. Min Jun crossed the room and stopped at the opposite side of the table, standing, not sitting, because sitting would commit him to the conversation before he understood what the conversation was. The man looked at him for a moment and said, "You are smaller than I expected." "People usually say that," Min Jun said. "Sit down," the man said. "I am not Kang Hyun Seo and I am not anyone he sent. I wrote the note because I was in the back corridor when you asked your question this afternoon, and I have been waiting 17 years for someone to ask that question in a room where at least 2 instructors could hear it." Min Jun sat down. "Who are you?" The man looked at the candle for a moment. "My name is Oh Sung-chul. I was an archivist in the Administrative Documentation Office for 19 years. I retired from that position 6 years ago. I am currently employed as a cataloging consultant on a limited contract, which gives me occasional access to the building but no institutional standing and no formal authority." He paused. "I am also the person who misfiled the report with the initials KSH." Min Jun was very still. "You misfiled it," he said. "Deliberately?" "Yes," Oh Sun-chul said. "I misfiled it deliberately. I placed it in the wrong folder, in the wrong year section, where it would be difficult to find by someone doing a routine administrative review but possible to find by someone looking specifically for it. I have been waiting for someone to look specifically for it." He looked at Min Jun with the flat, specific attention of someone who has been patient for a very long time and is not quite prepared to believe that patience has finally produced a result. "You found it," he said. "Who else knows?" "One person," Min Jun said carefully. "Instructor Eugene Tae." Oh Sung-chul nodded slowly. "I know of Eugene Tae. Field instructor, practical cohorts. Not part of the formation establishment. Not connected to the committee structure. He seemed to be running a private assessment. That is either very good or insufficient, depending on what you plan to do next." "I plan to complete the picture," Min Jun said. "What I found in the archive gives me the letters and the 30-year recommendation and the language revision." What I don't have is the full count. He looked at Oh Sung-chul directly. How many students? The old man closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the flatness was still there, but underneath it something else was present, something that had been contained for a long time under the weight of institutional life and was now being allowed into the open air very carefully. The way you open a container you are not entirely sure is stable. That depends on what you count, he said. If you count documented injuries from the consolidation technique that were recorded in the original clinical language before the revision, the number I personally processed in my time as archivist is 114. He said it plainly, the way people say numbers they have rehearsed so many times they have worn through the shock of them into something that is only arithmetic. That is the number I can account for with direct documentary knowledge. It does not include the period before my tenure. It does not include cases reclassified as transfers before the healer documentation was completed. It does not include students whose families were managed privately through institutional channels outside the formal record. He paused. The actual number is larger. I do not know the actual number. I know that it is larger. Min-jun looked at the candle between them. 114. In the years he had personally observed. Not counting the ones before. Not counting the ones managed off the record. The ones who were managed privately, he said. What does that mean? Oh Sung-chul looked at him with the expression of a man deciding how much of a weight to give to a 10-year-old and concluding, not without difficulty, that the 10-year-old had already demonstrated he could carry more than his size suggested. It means that families with significant institutional connections who raised formal questions about their children's injuries were given private explanations and private settlements. Not legal instruments. Institutional courtesies. Access to advanced facilities, scholarship extensions for siblings, letters of commendation for future placement. The kind of currency that powerful families accept in place of accountability when the institution offering it is the same one their family name is carved into. And the families without connections? Oh Sung-chul said nothing for a moment. The ones without connections received the standardized documentation. Adverse response to upper load channeling. Individual frailty. Transfer notation. He turned one of his hands over on the table, looking at the palm. I typed many of those documents. I filed many of them. For 12 years I typed them and filed them and told myself that the system worked the way systems work and that my specific contribution to it was neutral because I was only processing what others had decided. He closed his hand. And then in my 13th year, I processed the report of a boy named Park Seon-woo, who was 11 years old, who had been enrolled on an academic scholarship, who had no family connection to any institutional patron, and who achieved complete pathway collapse during a full extension assessment and was transferred to a residential care arrangement that the documentation described as a family placement. I know it was a family placement because I typed the transfer notation. I also know, because I was responsible for the residential records of scholarship students, that Park Seon-woo had no living family. He was an orphan. There was no family placement. There was a notation saying family placement, and then there was no further record of Park Seon-woo anywhere in the Academy's documentation system. The candle between them was the only moving thing in the room. Its small flame turned and turned in the still air. Min-jun thought of the empty record. The name that appeared once and then was organized out of existence. The system processing what it could not accommodate by making it administratively invisible. What happened to him? Min-jun said. It was not quite a question because he already understood the shape of the answer. I don't know, Oh Sung-chul said. That is the honest answer. I do not know what happened to Park Seon-woo after the transfer notation was filed. What I know is that I filed it, and that after I filed it, I began keeping my own record. Separately. Outside the institutional system. Everything I personally processed that I believed was being misrepresented in the formal documentation. He reached into his coat and produced a slim-bound notebook, the kind used for personal accounting rather than official records, cloth-covered, worn at the corners, with a small brass clasp that he did not open. He set it on the table between them. This is 17 years of a parallel record, he said. Names. Dates. Discrepancies between what I processed and what I knew to be true. Specific instances of documentation that I believe was deliberately falsified or deliberately obscured. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at Minjun. I have been carrying this for 17 years without knowing what to do with it, because I understood that taking it to any institutional authority would require that authority to acknowledge what the record implied, and the institutional authority and the people responsible for the record are not separate entities. He pushed the notebook across the table. I hid the report with the initials. I waited. I believed that eventually someone would come looking for exactly what you were looking for. Minjun put his hand on the notebook but did not pick it up immediately. He looked at Oh Sung-chul. Why not Eugene Tae? Why me? The old man looked at him with the first expression that was not flat or exhausted but something more complicated, almost reluctant. Because Eugene Tae is an instructor with institutional standing. The moment he moves formally, the institution moves against him formally. His access is revoked. His record is reviewed. His motives become the subject. It has happened before to people in his position who tried to raise these questions. He paused. You have no institutional standing. You have no record worth attacking. You are a 10-year-old service worker with no mana, and that means the institution does not have the tools it normally uses. He held Minjun's gaze. What it cannot attack formally, it can only try to ignore. And you have already demonstrated that you are not ignorable. Minjun picked up the notebook. It was heavier than its size suggested, the weight of years of careful documentation pressed into its pages. There is something else, Oh Sung-chul said. He said it with the quality of a person delivering the part of the information they had been postponing, the part that sat at the center of everything and required the other parts to be said first so that this part could be understood in its proper scale. 3 years ago, the Formation Division began planning a large-scale simultaneous assessment. The Grand Evaluation, which is scheduled for the end of the current academic year. In the Grand Evaluation, all cohorts from 3rd through 7th year participate simultaneously in a synchronized formation exercise. The exercise uses a modified version of the consolidation technique as its foundational sequence, pushed to full extension by every participant at the same time, under a unified amplification array. Minjun looked at him. Simultaneously, he said. Simultaneously, Oh Sung-chul confirmed. Using the same technique. At full extension. With the strongest students in the academy all engaged in the same load-bearing phase at the same moment, under an amplification system designed to increase output across all participants proportionally. He let Minjun work through the implications. Individual injuries occur when one student hits the structural flaw at full extension, Minjun said slowly. But the injury occurs because the load cannot be absorbed safely at that point. It fractures inward. Yes. If every strong student hits that same point simultaneously, under a shared amplification array, the load does not fracture inward per individual, Oh Sung-chul said. It propagates outward through the array. The array connects them. What one person cannot absorb becomes the next person's incoming load, and the next, and the system amplifies rather than dampens the cascade. The candle was very small in the large dark room. Outside, somewhere in the upper corridors, a night bell rang twice. How many students participate in the Grand Evaluation? Minjun said. All cohorts from 3rd through 7th year, Oh Sung-chul said. Approximately 340 students. Minjun looked at the notebook in his hands. He looked at the candle. He looked at the old archivist who had been carrying 17 years of parallel record and waiting for someone to come looking, who had typed the names of 114 injured students and one disappeared orphan into the academy's formal record and then written them down again, differently, truly, in a cloth-covered book that he had kept hidden for all those years like a counterfiling against institutional amnesia. Does anyone in the current administration know about the cascade risk? Minjun asked. Oh Sung-chul looked at the table. The physics of it were described in an internal technical review conducted during the planning phase of the Grand Evaluation, he said. The review was commissioned by the Formation Division Advisory Panel. The review was completed. It was submitted. It was received. He paused. I know it was received because I was still on limited contract at that time and I processed the submission documentation. And the grand evaluation was confirmed as scheduled, Oh Sung-chul said. 4 months after the technical review was received. Min-jun set the notebook down on the table in front of him and looked at it for a long moment in the candlelight. 340 students. A cascade amplified by the array connecting them. The same structural flaw that had injured students one at a time for 30 years, running simultaneously through every strong channeler in the academy at once, multiplied by the thing that was supposed to make them better. He thought of the letters in the archive, the two officials agreeing on documentation standards. He thought of the phrase the current system has already processed. He thought of Park Seon-woo's family placement with no family. He thought of Lim Chai-won practicing alone in the corridor with the careful, serious dedication of someone who could not afford to be anything less than excellent, pushing his form toward the extension point the way the curriculum had been built to make him do, the way every good student had been built to do, because the better you were the more precisely you arrived at exactly the place where the flaw was waiting. I need to ask you something, Min-jun said. Oh Sung-chul looked at him. In 17 years of keeping this record, Min-jun said, did you ever try to tell anyone? The old man looked at the notebook. He looked at his hands. He looked at the wall beyond Min-jun's head with the expression of a person who has made a detailed accounting of their own failures and keeps the ledger current. Once, he said. 12 years ago. To a senior faculty member I believed I could trust. He stopped. What happened? The grand evaluation was that faculty member's proposal, Oh Sung-chul said. The room held that for a moment. The candle had burned low enough that the light barely reached the edges of the table. Min-jun picked up the notebook and the boiler satchel and stood. I need to find Eugene Tae tonight, he said. I know you said not to tell him. But what you've given me is too large to carry without him knowing. Oh Sung-chul looked at him for a long moment with the exhausted, complicated expression of a man watching a sequence he set in motion 17 years ago finally begin to move and not being entirely certain whether he was witnessing rescue or a different and larger catastrophe of his own making. Yes, he said quietly. Tell him. He blew out the candle. The room went dark and Min-jun moved through it from memory, which was the only reliable map he had ever had, and went to find Eugene Tae, carrying 340 names that had not yet been written into any record but were waiting to be Eugene Tae. Listened without interrupting, which was how Min-jun knew the information was landing at the right weight. Lesser reactions interrupted because they needed to manage their own discomfort. You sat across the narrow table in the equipment room with his hands flat on the wood and his eyes on Min-jun's face, and he let the full picture arrive in sequence, the way you let a building reveal its structural damage by walking through every room before you decide where the wall has failed. Min-jun spoke for 20 minutes. He gave it in the order it mattered, not the order it had happened. Oh Sung-chul first, the parallel record, the 17 years of counter-documentation. Then Park Seon-woo, the name that had been filed into nothing. Then the 114. Then the cascade physics. Then the grand evaluation. Then the technical review that had been received and acknowledged and placed somewhere it would not interfere with the schedule. When he finished, the equipment room was very quiet. Outside, the academy's night sounds continued their indifferent routine. You did not speak for a long time. He looked at the notebook on the table between them, which Min-jun had placed there without opening it, because it was Oh Sung-chul's document and the decision of when to open it felt like it should belong to the person who had kept it for 17 years. 340 students, you said finally. Approximately, Min-jun said. 3rd through 7th cohort. The strongest in each year selected by assessment ranking to participate in the full extension phase of the grand evaluation array. Which means the students least likely to fail the form naturally, you said. He was working through it aloud, not asking Min-jun to confirm, just thinking at the speed the implications required. The ones who have the precision to hit the structural flaw most accurately. The ones the academy considers its best outcomes. Yes, Min-jun said. And the amplification array connects them during the synchronized phase. What propagates through one propagates through all, scaled by the amplification coefficient. Yu's jaw tightened. The array was designed to demonstrate collective formation power. A showcase event. The amplification is the point of it. It also means the cascade cannot be contained by individual failure margins, Minjun said. In solo practice, when one student hits the flaw, the injury is bounded by that student's channeling volume. In the array, under amplification, the energy doesn't fracture inward. It routes through the connection. He paused. Into the next student. And the next. You stood and moved to the equipment shelves without particular purpose, the movement of a man who needed to be not sitting without having anywhere specific to go. He stood with his back to Minjun for a moment. The technical review, he said. You're certain it was received before the schedule confirmation? Oh, Sungchul processed the submission documentation. He is certain. He could be mistaken. He could be misremembering. Minjun said nothing. You turned around. He looked at Minjun with the honest, unsparing expression he used when he was not performing competence but actually exercising it. He is not misremembering, you said. It was not a question. No, Minjun said. He kept a parallel record for 17 years. He is not the kind of person who misremembers things he considered important enough to write down separately. You came back to the table and sat. He opened the notebook. Minjun looked away, because the names in the notebook were not his to read without reason. They were Oh Sungchul's 17 years of bearing witness to a decision someone else had made, and looking at them required the gravity of that. He looked at the wall instead and listened to the sound of you turning pages slowly, reading not quickly but completely, the way he read everything that mattered. The reading took a long time. Minjun waited. At some point during the waiting he became aware that he was very tired, not the ordinary tiredness of physical work, which he was accustomed to and which sat in his back and his hands, but the deeper tiredness that came from carrying a weight of consequence that was too large for any single person and which he had been carrying in various forms since before he had language for what it was. When you closed the notebook, his face had the quality of a man who has just read something that has reorganized several things he thought he knew about the landscape he was standing in. Oh Sungchul named the faculty member he approached 12 years ago, he said. The one who proposed the grand evaluation. Yes, Minjun said. You did not say the name aloud. He put the notebook down and looked at the table surface for a moment. Senior Magister Cho Byung-il, he said eventually, quietly, the way you say a name when you are the first person to say it in a context that will not allow you to unsay it. He holds the Formation Division Senior Chair. He oversees the Grand Evaluation Planning Committee. He has been at the Academy for 31 years. Minjun had known this from the moment Oh Sungchul had said the grand evaluation was that faculty member's proposal. He had been carrying the name as a piece of architecture since then, the load-bearing wall of the entire structure. He was also, you said, more slowly, one of the 3 signatories on the Curriculum Committee approval 22 years ago. Yes. Which means he has been at the center of this for the entirety of the period the records cover. Yes. Another long silence. The lamp in the equipment room was burning low. Minjun reached across and adjusted the wick without thinking, the automatic competence of someone who had replaced lamp wicks for years in the dark. I need to understand the cascade mechanics more precisely, you said. Not the general principle. The specific progression. In what order do students fail? What is the timeline? What are the physical signs in the seconds before the cascade becomes unstoppable? Minjun understood why he was asking. To intervene effectively, you needed to know not just that the cascade would happen but exactly when it became irreversible, because up to that point there was a window, and the width of that window was the difference between intervention and aftermath. I can give you the progression from the individual injury pattern, Minjun said. Extrapolating to the cascade requires assumptions about the amplification coefficient and the array geometry, which I don't have. The array geometry will be in the grand evaluation setup documentation, you said. That is held in the Formation Division Planning Office. Which is Cho Byung-il's administrative territory, Minjun said. Yes. They looked at each other. The setup documentation was the one piece they did not have. Without the array geometry, the cascade model was qualitative rather than quantitative. Qualitative was not sufficient to bring to anyone with the authority to halt the grand evaluation. It needed to be specific. Dates, sequences, numbers, the technical precision that made a claim impossible to dismiss as panic or misunderstanding or the hysterical projection of an unqualified child. The planning office has a secondary storage cabinet in the East Administrative Corridor, Minjun said. The same corridor where the boiler service tunnel runs adjacent to the wall. You looked at him. No, he said. Absolutely not. The boiler inspection cycle runs again in 3 weeks, Minjun said. That is too close to the evaluation date, you said. If the evaluation is 8 weeks out, 3 weeks of planning time after a second archive visit is not enough operational margin for what we would need to do with the information. Then I need to go sooner. Minjun. You used his name directly, which he rarely did. The first visit was undetected because nobody was specifically watching the archive. Now Kang Hyun SEO is watching you. The administrative complaint has been filed. Your movements are being noticed at a different level of attention than before. Minjun looked at the notebook. Approximately 340 students, he said again. He did not say it to pressure you. He said it because it was the fact that the entire conversation kept returning to, the weight that made every other calculation reorganize around it. You looked at the notebook also. He breathed out through his nose. I know, he said. I know the number. They sat with it between them for a moment, the number and the notebook and the low lamp and the sound of the academy settling into deeper night outside the room. Minjun had been organizing the cascade model in his head since Oh Sungchul described the amplification array, and he returned to it now while Yu was thinking, building it out from what he knew. The consolidation technique's third extension node was the failure point. In individual practice, a student who hit the node under full load experienced a fracture of the median channeling pathway, the severity depending on channeling volume and precision. In the grand evaluation array, the connection between students meant the fracture energy did not terminate at the individual boundary. It entered the array. The array, designed to amplify collective output, would treat the fracture energy as input. It would amplify it. It would route it to the next connected student. That student would receive both their own load and the amplified fracture energy from the previous student, compounding at the third extension node, which would fracture harder and sooner, routing more energy into the array. The cascade would accelerate with each additional failure because the array's amplification coefficient would grow as more fracture energy entered the system. The students at the highest precision and power levels would be the last to fail individually and the first to push the cascade past the point of recovery, because their sustained performance would be what kept the array functioning long enough to accumulate catastrophic load. He thought of the grand evaluation's showcase purpose. The best students performing simultaneously, each holding their form to full extension as long as possible, demonstrating collective formation excellence. Every quality the academy had trained them toward, precision, endurance, commitment to full extension, working in perfect concert to produce the worst possible outcome from the structural flaw they had all been required to pass through. The training would do exactly what training was supposed to do. It would make them excellent. The excellence would kill them. I need to know the amplification coefficient and the array connection geometry, Minjun said. Without those two values, I cannot calculate the cascade timeline. Without the timeline, we cannot demonstrate the point of irreversibility. Without the point of irreversibility, anyone we bring this to can say we are speculating. He looked at you. They will say we are speculating anyway. But they cannot say it and have it be true if I have those numbers. Yu was quiet for a long moment. His hand rested on the closed notebook. Minjun watched his face and saw the calculation happening, the weighing of operational risk against the number 340, the balance that only went one way regardless of how carefully you measured it. The planning office secondary cabinet, you said finally. You said the boiler service tunnel runs adjacent to the East Administrative Corridor wall. Yes. What is the access structure on the cabinet itself? Standard institutional lock. The same pattern as the archive cabinets. And the wall access? The same brick removal method? Different wall construction in the administrative corridor. Solid masonry from the renovation period. No thermal cycling separation. He paused. But there is a service hatch in the corridor ceiling, above the cabinet, used for the overhead lamp chain maintenance. It has a pressure latch from above. You looked at him. Above, he said. The corridor above the East Administrative Section is the senior faculty private reading gallery, Minjun said. The gallery floor has a maintenance inspection panel for the lamp infrastructure. It is not locked from the gallery side. It is accessed during monthly lamp inspections by whichever service worker is assigned to the gallery that week. He waited. The monthly lamp inspection for the senior faculty gallery is scheduled in 6 days, he said. I can arrange to be the assigned worker. Yu's expression was the particular expression of a man who was trying to remember when exactly a conversation became a plan and failing to identify the precise transition point. The gallery itself, he said. Senior faculty access only. During evening hours, yes. During early morning maintenance hours, before the 6th bell, the gallery is categorized as a non-restricted service area under lamp inspection protocol. Minjun met his eyes steadily. I have been reading the service protocol documentation for 3 years. You looked at him for a long moment. He had the expression of a man who had spent his career in the field where plans met reality and who understood at a structural level that the gap between them was where most casualties occurred. He also had the expression of a man who had just read 114 names in a cloth-covered notebook and knew there was a larger number behind that number and knew what was scheduled to happen to the students the academy had trained to be exactly precise enough to be destroyed by its own foundational curriculum. 6 days, you said. Yes, Minjun said. I need to be visible and accounted for during that window, you said. I will arrange a faculty review meeting for the early morning of the 7th day. It will require my presence in the central wing from the 4th bell through the 8th. That gives me a 2-bell window, Minjun said. In and out before the gallery opens. If you are found in the senior gallery during that window, I am a lamp inspection worker with a scheduled maintenance authorization, Minjun said. I will have the service entry form. The form will not cover access to the administrative corridor below through the ceiling hatch. No, Minjun agreed. It will not cover that. They looked at each other. The lamp had burned to nearly nothing. In the last of its light, Yu's face held the particular expression Minjun had come to associate with the instructor's truest assessments, stripped of institutional deference and professional composure, showing only the judgment of a man who had been in enough situations where things could go badly to recognize the difference between a plan with acceptable risk and a plan with unacceptable risk. The difference, in this case, was 340 names that had not yet been written anywhere but could be, if the cascade ran as the physics required, within 8 weeks. Come back safe, you said. It was not approval of the plan. It was not a sanction or an instruction. It was the only honest thing available to say to a 10-year-old who was about to do something extremely dangerous for reasons that were entirely correct. I will, Minjun said. He picked up the boiler satchel. He left the notebook with you, because the notebook needed to be somewhere safe while he was in the gallery, and because Oh Sungchul's 17 years of careful witness deserved to rest in the hands of someone who would not lose it. He walked toward the door. Before he reached it, you spoke once more behind him. Minjun. He stopped. If something goes wrong in the gallery, you said, and you are found, and they bring you before an administrative review, say nothing until I am present. Nothing. Not a word about the archive, the notebook, Oh Sungchul, or the cascade model. Do you understand? Yes, Minjun said. And if they do not let you wait for me? Minjun thought about this. He thought about Magister Han's incident report and the standardized language and the way the institution translated inconvenient events into manageable documentation. He thought about Park Seon-woo's family placement with no family. He thought about what happened to inconvenient things inside a system that had been managing inconvenience for 30 years with administrative precision. Then I will ask them, he said quietly, why the consolidation technique's third extension node produces injuries exclusively in students executing the form correctly. And I will ask it loudly enough that at least 2 people in the room can hear it. He opened the door. The corridor outside was dark and empty and smelled of cold stone and lamp oil. The academy was asleep around him, or pretending to be, which was its preferred state for both things. He walked toward the stairwell in the 6 days between now and the ceiling hatch above the planning office cabinet, carrying the Cascade model inside him like a count he had not yet finished, because the final number was still locked behind a standard institutional cabinet in a corridor he had not yet reached, and he would not know the true shape of what was coming until he had it, and he could not stop what was coming until he could prove the shape of it to someone with the power and the will to act, and the power and the will were somewhere ahead of him in the building, waiting to be found or waiting to be built, and the 6 days were already running. The lamp inspection authorization for the senior faculty reading gallery was a single-line entry in the monthly service schedule, written in the same abbreviated notation as every other maintenance task, indistinguishable from the 40 other entries surrounding it on the service board. Min-jun had written it in himself 3 days prior during the regular schedule update, when the corridor supervisor had stepped away for his evening round and left the service board unattended for 4 minutes, which was 2 minutes more than necessary. He arrived at the gallery entrance at the 5th bell -20, which put him inside the authorized maintenance window and outside the period when senior faculty used the space. The gallery was a long, narrow room on the 3rd floor north side, lined with private reading carrels separated by wooden partitions, a space designed for the kind of solitary concentrated work that required both quiet and the implicit statement of status that came from having a room to work in that most people in the building could not enter. At this hour it was empty and dim, the Corel lamps unlit, the morning light barely beginning at the east windows. He moved along the gallery's south wall with the lamp inspection kit, checking each overhead chain mechanism with the unhurried competence of someone doing exactly what his authorization said he was doing, in case anyone passed through before he reached the section he needed. The maintenance inspection panel was at the gallery's east end, set into the floor behind the last Corel, a square of fitted planking with a recessed iron ring. He lifted it without difficulty, the gravity latch releasing cleanly, and looked down into the space below. The east administrative corridor was directly beneath him, perhaps 2 meters down. The overhead lamp chain infrastructure ran through a narrow service cavity between the gallery floor and the corridor ceiling, just wide enough for a small person to move through horizontally. The planning office secondary storage cabinet was visible from this angle, a dark wooden unit set against the corridor's north wall, its top approximately level with the bottom of the service cavity. He lowered himself through the panel, pulling the lamp kit after him, and worked his way through the cavity toward the cabinet's position. The cavity was tighter than the heating tunnel had been, the wood of the floor joists pressing close on both sides, and he moved with the controlled, breath-managed slowness of someone who understood that the noise of a person moving above a corridor ceiling was a specific, recognizable sound if you happened to be below it listening. He reached the position above the cabinet and found the ceiling hatch that the lamp chain service had historically used. It was smaller than the gallery panel, barely wide enough for his shoulders, and the latch mechanism was stiff from long disuse. He worked it with the flat of his palm, applying pressure in small increments, feeling the mechanism resist and then give in stages, until the hatch dropped open a half-inch and he could see the corridor below. Empty. The administrative corridor in the early morning had the specific quality of spaces that existed to house authority rather than to serve it: formal proportions, polished floors, the kind of quiet that was not peaceful but hierarchical, the quiet of a space that did not need to be active because its power operated through other means. He lowered himself through the hatch and dropped onto the top of the cabinet, then to the floor, with a sound he had been controlling since before he reached the cavity, landing with the weight distribution that 3 years of moving through spaces he was not supposed to be in had taught him to manage automatically. He tried the cabinet lock. It was the standard institutional pattern, as he had assessed from a distance during routine corridor cleaning shifts over the previous 2 weeks. He had the tension tool and pick from the maintenance kit, where they lived alongside legitimate equipment as part of the lock clearing set used by service staff when cabinet keys were lost, which was a more common institutional problem than anyone in a formal position liked to admit. 40 seconds. The lock released. He opened the cabinet and began reading. The Grand Evaluation Setup documentation was in the second folder from the front, labeled with the current academic year and the event designation in the Academy's formal notation. It was a planning document, comprehensive, prepared by the Formation Division Coordination Office, containing the array geometry, the synchronization protocol, the amplification coefficient table, and the phase schedule for the evaluation's full extension collective sequence. Minjun read it with the focused, sequential encoding he used for everything critical, moving through the technical specifications with the attention of someone who had spent months building a model that was waiting for exactly these numbers to become complete. The amplification coefficient was higher than he had estimated. He had worked with a conservative assumption based on standard formation array parameters. The actual coefficient in the document was a value that had been specifically engineered for the Grand Evaluation's showcase purpose, designed to maximize visible collective output, to make the event as impressively large as possible, because the event was not only an assessment. It was a demonstration. Representatives from the high houses, from the regional military formation commands, from the Academy's institutional patrons would be present. The Grand Evaluation was a recruitment showcase, a funding justification, a proof of the Academy's product quality delivered in the form of 340 of its best students performing simultaneously at maximum capacity. The amplification coefficient, in the context of the cascade model, did not simply change the scale of the problem. It changed the timeline. With the standard coefficient he had assumed, the cascade would reach irreversibility in approximately 40 seconds after the first failure. With the actual coefficient in the document, the cascade would reach irreversibility in under 20 seconds. 20 seconds was not a window for intervention. 20 seconds was the time between a person noticing something was wrong and a person finishing the sentence in which they said so. He kept reading. The array geometry was a radial pattern, connecting students in concentric rings from the center outward, with the highest-ranked students positioned at the inner rings where the amplification effect was strongest. This was logical from a showcase perspective. The best students at the center, their output amplified and radiated outward, visible and impressive. From a cascade perspective, it meant the students most likely to sustain the form to full extension, and therefore most likely to hit the structural flaw with maximum precision, were the most directly connected to the amplification core. Their failure would not simply propagate outward through the array. It would be amplified at the core first, then propagated, arriving at the outer rings already scaled beyond the individual tolerance of every student in the connected system. Minjun completed his reading and closed the folder and replaced it exactly as he had found it, with the orientation and position he had memorized before touching it. He locked the cabinet. He climbed back to the corridor ceiling hatch, pulled himself through, worked through the service cavity, came up through the gallery panel, replaced the panel, and continued his lamp inspection for the remaining carols with hands that he kept deliberately steady because they wanted to do something else. He completed the inspection log. He left the gallery before the 6th bell. He found you in the equipment room at the 6th bell plus 10 and said, without preamble, "The coefficient is higher than I estimated. The cascade becomes irreversible in under 20 seconds from first failure." You looked at him for one moment. Then he said, "Show me the geometry." Minjun drew it from memory on the back of a service form, the radial array, the inner rings, the amplification core, the propagation pattern. He wrote the coefficient beside the drawing and the revised timeline beneath that. You studied it in silence for a long time. When he looked up, his face held the expression Minjun associated with the instructor's most important assessments, the stripped, undecorated face of someone seeing a thing clearly. "We cannot bring this to anyone inside the academy," you said. "No," Minjun agreed. Inside the academy, the documentation would be received by the same structure that had received the technical review, the same structure that had received the 30-year recommendation, the same structure that had been making consistent decisions about this curriculum for 3 decades. "I have a contact," you said slowly. "Outside the institutional structure. A former colleague who moved into the Regional Formation Oversight Commission 8 years ago. She is not connected to the Academy's patronage network. She has formal authority to request an external review of any formation event involving students under the jurisdiction of the Regional Educational Charter." He paused. "I have not spoken to her in 3 years. I do not know her current relationship with the people who hold patronage over the commission. But she has the authority, Minjun said. On paper, yes. Then we go to her, Minjun said. You nodded slowly. I will write to her today. Through an external carrier, not the Academy's internal mail system. She needs the full picture, Minjun said. The 30-year record, the language revision, the letters from the archive, Osunchal's notebook, the cascade model with the actual coefficient, and the array geometry. He looked at the drawing on the service form. She needs to understand that this is not a new discovery. This is a 30-year decision arriving at its logical conclusion. You picked up the service form and folded it carefully. I will write the letter today, he said again. Then 3 things happened in the following 4 days that changed the weight of the situation. The first was the formal inquiry notice delivered to Eugene Tay's faculty mailbox on the morning of the day after the gallery visit, requiring him to appear before an academic standards review panel to address concerns about his professional conduct regarding unauthorized use of student welfare documentation, specifically the lower incident records from the administrative annex. The inquiry had been filed by Magister Han. It was co-signed by the Senior Formation Division Coordinator. Minjun read the notice over Yu's shoulder in the equipment room and felt the shape of it settle into the larger pattern with the cold precision of a thing that had been anticipated but was worse in its actual form than in its anticipated one. The second thing was a service reassignment that moved Minjun from his current duties to a work rotation in the outer storage buildings, a cluster of structures on the far side of the Academy's grounds used for bulk supply storage and seasonal equipment, a physical removal from the central building and from any meaningful proximity to you, to the annex, to the administrative corridor, or to any space where information moved between people. The reassignment was signed by the quartermaster and contained no stated reason. The third thing was the hardest. Lim Chaiwan appeared at the service building where Minjun was moving crates on the second day of the reassignment, walking carefully, his left arm held slightly away from his body with the specific self-protective angle of someone managing pain they were trying not to show. He had been released from the healer wing. His scholarship status had been formally reclassified, as you had predicted, from academic merit allocation to provisional residential student, which meant his continued enrollment was contingent on demonstrating sufficient recovery of function within the next academic quarter, which the healer's assessment said was unlikely. He stood outside the storage building and looked at Minjun and said, simply, "You told me." Minjun set down the crate he was carrying. "Yes," he said. "I told you it would happen and you came anyway." "I know." Chaiwan's voice was not accusing. It was something more complicated, the voice of someone who had understood Minjun's warning perfectly and had gone ahead anyway because the institution had built every structural incentive around going ahead, and who was now standing in the wreckage of a correct decision made inside a system that had not allowed for any other choice. "I'm sorry," Minjun said. He meant it with the full weight of a person who understood that sorry was insufficient and said it anyway because inadequate acknowledgement was better than none. Chaiwan looked at him for a moment. "Is it true," he said. "What you said in that session? About the technique? About other students?" "Yes," Minjun said. "How many?" Minjun thought of Osunchal's notebook. Of the 114 names that were the documented ones. Of the number behind that number. Of Park Seon-woo. "Many," he said. "Over a long time." Chaiwan was quiet. He looked at his left hand, at the fingers that moved now with a slight delay, the neural pathway disruption expressing itself in the small mechanical gap between intention and response. "Are you going to stop it?" he said. It was not quite a question. It was the kind of statement that is phrased as a question because asking is the only form of agency available to someone who can no longer act directly. "Yes," Minjun said. Chaiwan nodded once, the nod of someone filing a statement for a record that does not yet exist but should. He turned and walked back across the yard, favoring his left side, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone learning to navigate a body that had been altered by a curriculum, carrying the specific dignity of a person who has been damaged by something that should have protected them and has decided not to hide the damage. Minjun watched him go and then picked up the crate and continued working, because the outer storage building assignment meant he had fewer hours near you and less access to information, and every hour he spent not moving the situation forward was an hour the grand evaluation's schedule advanced without opposition. That evening he found a message from you in the service station, passed through a first-year student you used as a neutral courier, written on plain paper in the abbreviated notation of the service schedule so that it would look like a work instruction. The message said the letter to the external contact had been sent. It also said the academic standards inquiry had been expedited, which meant the hearing had been moved to 3 days from now rather than the standard 2-week institutional timeline. Expedited meant someone wanted it resolved quickly. Resolved quickly, in the context of what you was doing, meant resolved in a way that removed him from the situation before he could take any further action. Minjun read the message twice and burned it in the furnace of the outer storage building's heating unit and thought about 3 days. He thought about the letter, which was traveling through an external carrier and would arrive at the regional commission in approximately the same 3-day window. He thought about whether the external contact would read it immediately or set it aside, whether she would act on a letter from a former colleague raising extraordinary claims about a major institutional event, or whether she would first make an inquiry to the academy, which would immediately reveal the letter's existence to the same people who had just expedited Yu's inquiry. He thought about the array geometry and the 20-second irreversibility window and the inner rings of the radial pattern where the most precise students would be positioned, each of them carrying 3 years of carefully trained excellence toward the structural flaw that had been waiting for exactly that quality for 30 years. He thought about the hearing in 3 days, and you standing before a panel that was co-signed by the man whose name was on the curriculum committee approval and whose proposal was the grand evaluation, and he thought about what happened to the only adult in the building who knew the full picture if that hearing went the way it had been expedited to go. Then he wrote a note of his own, on plain paper, in service notation, and passed it through the same first-year courier back to you. The note said, if the hearing removes you before the contact responds, give her the notebook directly. Not a summary. The notebook. Oh, Sunchul's 17 years of names. Because summaries could be argued with, and abstractions could be dismissed, but 114 names written in an old man's hand over 17 years of bearing witness to what an institution had decided to call by other names was not a document that a person with a functioning conscience could set aside and go home to their evening meal. It was the kind of document that stayed with you. The kind that made you understand, in the specific way that only names could make you understand, that the number was not a number. It was a directory of people who had been processed by a decision, one at a time, for 30 years, and who had been waiting in the record ever since for someone to count them properly. Minjun sent the note and returned to his crates, and worked, and waited, and counted the days. The hearing was held in the formal review chamber on the second floor of the Central Administrative Wing, a room designed with the specific architectural grammar of institutional authority, elevated panel seating, a single chair for the reviewed party positioned below and facing upward, stone walls that absorbed sound in a way that made voices feel final rather than conversational. Eugene Tay sat in the single chair with the composed, unhurried stillness of a man who had decided before entering the room that the hearing's outcome was less important than what he did around it. Minjun was not permitted inside the chamber. He stood in the service corridor that ran behind the chamber's east wall and listened through the old plasterwork and counted the voices. 3 panel members. Magister Han as the filing party. A recording secretary. And from the quality of the silences, the particular weighted pauses that fell after certain questions, a 6th presence that was not listed in the formal panel composition but whose authority was shaping the room's atmosphere the way a current shapes water even when it is not visible at the surface. Minjun had suspected this. He had told you to expect it. The hearing had been expedited and co-signed by the Senior Formation Division Coordinator, and a man who had managed a 30-year institutional decision did not co-sign an expedited inquiry and then absent himself from the outcome. Cho Byung-il was in the room. Minjun could not hear his voice distinctly through the wall. He could hear its effect. Questions that the panel asked and then restated in cleaner form after a silence. An answer from you that produced a pause longer than any answer warranted, the pause of people conferring in ways that did not enter the record. The formal language of the proceedings maintaining its structure while the actual proceedings ran beneath it like the heating infrastructure beneath the academy's floors, invisible, functional, doing the real work that kept the surface temperature regulated. He stood at the wall and listened and thought about the letter. The letter had been sent 4 days ago. The external carrier service used by private faculty for personal correspondence operated on a 3-day delivery cycle to the regional administrative center. If the letter had been received yesterday, and if Yu's contact had read it immediately, and if she had taken it seriously rather than setting it aside or making a preliminary inquiry to the academy, there might be something in motion that Minjun could not see from a service corridor. There might not be. That was the architecture of what he could and could not know from where he stood. The hearing continued for another 40 minutes. When the panel voices concluded and the chamber sound shifted from deliberation to procedure, Minjun moved away from the wall and walked through the service corridor to the eastern stairwell and descended to the ground floor and waited near the service exit. You came through 12 minutes later. He walked with the same composed, unhurried quality he had carried into the room, which told Minjun the verdict before you said anything, because a man who had received a good outcome would have moved differently. He would have moved with the release that good outcomes produce. You moved with the contained resolution of a man who had received the outcome he expected and had already organized himself around it. Suspended from teaching duties, you said. Pending full review of my conduct regarding student welfare documentation access. Effective immediately. My access to the Academy's internal records system has been revoked. My faculty mail is subject to administrative review. He stopped and looked at Minjun steadily. I am still physically present in the building. The suspension is administrative, not residential. I have 14 days before a formal removal order would require me to vacate faculty accommodation. 14 days, Minjun said. Yes. The grand evaluation is in 53 days. Yes. They stood in the ground floor service corridor in the thin morning light that came through the small high windows, and the distance between 14 days and 53 days sat between them with the specific weight of a gap that was not bridgeable by the methods they had been using. The official path was closed. You had no institutional standing to bring a formal challenge. The internal documentation was inaccessible to him. The inquiry had served its purpose, which was not to adjudicate a question of professional conduct but to neutralize the one adult in the building who had been moving the information toward the surface. Minjun looked at you and said, "Did Cho Byung-il speak during the hearing?" Yu's expression shifted slightly. Twice. Both times to clarify points of procedural framing. He did not speak to the substance. He didn't need to, Minjun said. You nodded. No. He didn't. The morning corridor sounds of the academy moved around them, early students, breakfast service workers, the distant bell marking the first formal session of the day. The building was waking into its routine, the machinery of instruction and assessment and formation training beginning its daily cycle, 340 students moving toward their classes and their practice sessions and the carefully structured progression of a curriculum that had been making a 30-year decision one semester at a time. The notebook, Minjun said. You still have it. Yes. And the letters from the archive. The ones you put in your coat. Yes. If your contact responds, you can give them to her directly. You do not need institutional access for that. Correct. And if she doesn't respond before the 14 days? You looked at the wall. He looked at it the way he had looked at walls and windows and floor surfaces throughout the months Minjun had known him, the specific looking away of a man thinking about something he needed to think about without an audience for his face while he did it. Then he looked back. Oh Sungchul, he said. The notebook is his. If my position becomes untenable before the contact responds, Oh Sungchul and his notebook together are more credible than either alone. He is a former administrative archivist of 19 years with a documented record and a specific account of deliberate misrepresentation. His testimony, paired with the original documentation, constitutes the kind of evidence that an external oversight body cannot procedurally ignore without creating its own liability. He's been carrying it for 17 years without acting, Minjun said. He acted when he hid the report, you said. He acted when he wrote the note and brought you to that reading room. He was waiting for the right structure around him. We are the structure. Minjun thought of Oh Sungchul in the dark reading room with the candle, the exhausted patience of a man who had been keeping a parallel record for 17 years and had finally placed it in moving hands. The right structure. He thought of Chaiwan walking across the yard with his left arm held carefully away from his body. He thought of the inner rings of the radial array, the most talented students closest to the amplification core, each of them trained to hold the form to full extension, trained to push through resistance, trained by the institution's own assessment structure to be exactly the kind of channeler who would hit the structural flaw with the most precise, sustained, catastrophic accuracy. He thought about 20 seconds. The revised timeline with the actual amplification coefficient. 20 seconds from first failure to irreversibility. He had been circling this number since the gallery visit, turning it in his mind the way you turn a stone that is too heavy to carry and too important to leave. 20 seconds was the gap between the cascade becoming inevitable and the cascade becoming impossible to stop. 20 seconds was the window in which every intervention that had not already been positioned would fail to arrive in time. Which meant the intervention had to be positioned before the evaluation began. Not during. Before. The only intervention that could work was one that prevented the evaluation from running in the form that made the cascade possible. An external oversight suspension of the event. A technical modification of the array that removed the amplification component. A formal acknowledgement of the structural flaw that required the consolidation technique to be modified before the full extension phase could proceed. Any of these required external authority. External authority required use contact, or Oh Sungchul's testimony, or both, to reach someone with jurisdiction before the 53 days ran out. I need to know something, Minjun said. What you told me about the technical review. The one conducted during the grand evaluation planning phase. The one that was received and acknowledged before the schedule was confirmed. Yes, you said. Who conducted it? You was quiet for a moment. The Formation Division Technical Assessment Team, he said. Under the direction of the Senior Formation Division Coordinator. Minjun looked at him. Cho Byung-ail's team conducted the technical review of an event Cho Byung-ail proposed. Yes. And the review found the cascade risk. It found what Oh Sungchul described. A propagation risk under amplified array conditions. And Cho Byung-ail received this review and confirmed the schedule. The corridor was quiet around them for a moment. The implication was not subtle. It was the most direct line in the entire 30-year architecture, the shortest distance between a person and a decision. A man who had commissioned a review of his own proposal, received a finding that his proposal would cascade injure a significant portion of the Academy's student population, and confirmed the schedule anyway. That review document, Minjun said. Is it in the Formation Division planning files? It should be, yes. It would have been filed alongside the setup documentation as part of the evaluation's formal administrative record. I have the setup documentation, Minjun said. I encoded it during the gallery visit. The array geometry, the amplification coefficient, the phase schedule. He paused. But I did not see a separate technical review document in the planning cabinet. It may be filed separately, you said. Or it may have been removed from the planning cabinet after the schedule confirmation. They looked at each other. A document that had been received and then removed from the relevant file was not a missing document. It was a managed one. It was the same logic as the misfiled report with the initials KSH. It was the same logic as the language revision. The same 30-year logic of a system that managed its evidence rather than its problems, that moved things rather than fixing them, that trusted in administrative distance to do what accountability would not be permitted to do. I need to find the review document, Minjun said. Without it, what we have is circumstantial. With it, what we have is direct. Where would it be if not in the planning cabinet? Minjun thought about the architecture of the administrative wing, about the flow of documents through an institutional system, about where things went when they needed to be kept but not easily found. The Senior Formation Coordinator's personal administrative files, he said. Not the shared planning office. His personal cabinet. In his private office suite. You was very still. That is not the service tunnel, he said. That is not the ceiling hatch. That is not a maintenance authorization or a lamp inspection protocol. No, Minjun said. It isn't. The private office suite of the Senior Formation Division Coordinator was on the 4th floor of the central wing. It was not a service space. It had no maintenance infrastructure that ran adjacent to it, no boiler tunnels, no heating system access points, no overhead lamp chain cavities with pressure hatches. It was secured with the Academy's highest internal access classification and attended by a private administrative aide during all waking hours. It was the most protected physical space in the building outside the headmaster's chambers. Min Jun had been thinking about it since the gallery visit. He had been thinking about it the way you think about a wall you need to pass through when all the passages you know are on the wrong side of it. There is one person in this building with legitimate access to the 4th floor central wing outside of senior faculty, he said. You waited. Kang Hyun SEO, Min Jun said. First-ranked cohort representative. He has a standard access credential for the senior faculty corridor as part of his role as Formation Division student liaison. He watched Yu's face process this. Hyun SEO, Yu said. His voice carried the specific quality of a man picking up something sharp without knowing whether to hold it or set it down. He believes in the system, Min Jun said. Genuinely. He is not cruel in the way of people who enjoy it. He is a person who has been given the best version of what the Academy offers and who has built his understanding of everything around the integrity of that offering. He paused. He does not know what the system has been doing with students who do not have his standing. You cannot know that, you said carefully. No, Min Jun agreed. I cannot know it. But I can test it. He thought about the teaching room. The moment when the question had landed and Hyun Seo's expression had shifted for one visible second, the involuntary adjustment of a person whose framework had encountered a variable it could not process with existing tools. In the review session, Min Jun said, when I asked why the technique injures only correctly executing students, Hyun Seo did not have an answer. He covered it immediately. But he did not have an answer. He looked at you. A person who is complicit in 30 years of institutional damage does not need an answer. They have a different kind of response. They redirect. Hyun Seo paused. You was quiet for a long moment. Outside the service corridor, the Academy's morning continued. Somewhere on the upper floors, a formation session was beginning, the rhythmic call and response of an instructor counting beats reaching them through the building's stone and wood like a pulse. If you approach Hyun Seo, you said slowly, and he is not what you believe, or if he is what you believe but makes a different choice when confronted with a direct ask, you will have revealed everything to the person with the most direct access to Cho Byung-il. Yes, Min Jun said. And if he is what you believe, and he makes the right choice, you said, you will have the one person in this building with both the access and the standing to reach the review document without a maintenance authorization, a heating tunnel, or a ceiling hatch. Yes, Min Jun said again. You looked at him for a long time. The sound of the formation session counted its beats above them. Min Jun thought of the grand evaluation in 53 days. He thought of the inner rings of the radial array. He thought of Chaiwon's left hand, and Park Seon-woo's family placement, and Oh Seung-chul's candle burning down in the dark reading room, and the 114 names in the cloth-covered notebook, and the number behind that number, and the phrase that had been living at the center of everything since he had found it in the archive. The alternative is acknowledgement, and acknowledgement at this stage would require us to account for everyone the current system has already processed. He thought about processed. He thought about what the word meant when the system did not change and the processing continued and the grand evaluation came and the amplification array connected 340 of the most talented young channelers in the Academy in a radial pattern under a coefficient engineered for maximum output, and the consolidation technique's third extension node did what it had been doing for 30 years, reliably, precisely, to every student talented enough to reach it. If we do nothing, Min Jun said quietly, and the evaluation runs as planned, and the cascade behaves as the physics requires it to behave, how many students are we accounting for? Yu's jaw tightened. He did not answer immediately. He looked at the wall. He looked at the floor. He looked at the ceiling, at the building above them, at the 53 days ahead of them, at everything the question contained. Not dozens, he said finally. His voice was very low, the voice of a man delivering a fact he would have preferred to be wrong about. At the amplification coefficient in the evaluation documentation, with the radial array geometry, with the inner ring distribution of the highest precision students. He stopped. Not dozens, he said again. Then he said the number. And Minjun stood in the service corridor of the academy that had been his entire world for his entire life, a 10-year-old boy with no mana and no family name and no academic standing and no formal credential of any kind, and he held the number in his mind alongside the 114 names in the notebook and the 30-year recommendation that had never been answered in the phrase about processing in the 20-second window and the inner rings and Chaiwan walking across the yard. With his left arm held carefully, and he made the only decision available to him, which was the same decision he had been making since he was 7 years old and had first noticed the pattern and had been, for the first time, ignored. He would not wait for the structure to produce the right outcome. He was the structure. He and Yuan Sungchul and 17 years of a parallel record and a cascade model and a set of letters and a misfiled report and a 10-year archive of names that the institution had called by other names and believed it had organized into silence. He would find Hyun SEO. He would show him what a correctly executing student looked like from the outside of the formation circle, from the service corridor, from the mop water view that the academy had never considered a valid vantage point. He would show him what it looked like when you counted every case and put them in sequence and read them not as a series of individual unfortunate outcomes but as a single 30-year document written in the language of institutional decision. And then he would ask Hyun Seo the question that had been waiting for precisely the person who could answer it most usefully, not whether the system was broken, but whether the person who had been given the best version of it was willing to look at what the worst version had cost. Tell me where to find him, Minjun said. You told him. Minjun walked toward the stairs, toward the upper floors, toward the first-ranked student in the formation cohort who had everything the academy could give a person and who was, if Minjun's reading of a single moment of involuntary pause in a formal hearing room was correct, about to discover what that everything had been built on top of. Behind him, you said one more thing. He said it quietly, in the tone he used for the most important statements, the stripped, undecorated tone of a man speaking without institutional grammar, only truth. If you are wrong about him, you said, come straight back to me. Do not wait. Do not explain yourself to him. Come straight back. Minjun stopped on the first step of the stairwell. And if I'm right about him? A pause. Then the two of you find that document, you said, and you bring it to me, and we end this before the 53 days run out. Minjun climbed the stairs. The academy rose around him, floor by floor, the stone and timber and 40 years of institutional weight pressing upward into the formal air of the central wing, where the fourth floor held the private office suite of the man who had confirmed a schedule he had been told would kill his students, and the third floor held a first-ranked student who believed in a system and had not yet been required to believe in it past the point where it had cost him something real, and the ground floor held the service corridors and maintenance tunnels and heating infrastructure and all the spaces that the institution had built for the people it did not count, and somewhere in all of it, between the floors and the tunnels and the 17 years and the 53 days and the 20 seconds and the number you had just said aloud for the first time in any conversation anywhere, was the space where a decision had been made and remade and filed and refiled and managed and normalized for 30 years, the space that was not in any architectural plan but that was the actual structure of the building, the load-bearing element that everything rested on, and which was now, for the first time in 30 years, being approached from below, from the service side, by someone the system had no tool for and no notation for and no standardized documentation language for, because the system had never needed one. It had never expected to be found by someone who had no access and no authority and nothing to his name except 3 years of watching and counting and remembering and refusing, in the quiet and specific way of a person with no other weapon available, to look away.